My name is Joseph Lepak, and with my co-symposium editor, Isabella Marie, we are Nangano. We are we welcome you to the we have the pleasure of welcoming you to this year's Vermont Journal of Environmental Law Spring Symposium. The overall theme of this symposium is on sustainable development, really addressing that ultimately one of the key principles of Vermont law and graduate school is the idea of progressing forward with a sustainable economy. You know, many students have heard about that, the clean energy transition, and other various terms. However, ultimately, any economic activity or really any model of governance as we currently stand, will still have some form of impact and some effect on people and the environment. And so the symposium gathers panels from a wide variety of areas to address the governance, the social, environmental, and economic issues around various new developments in technology as well as just business practice. We would first like to introduce our keynote speaker. Unfortunately, Professor Todd Howland, who was our keynote, cannot join us in person. However, he thankfully has recorded a message that we will now play for the school for everyone. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you for coming this afternoon to the 27th Annual Symposium of the Vermont Journal of Environmental Law. I want to thank you for coming, and I'm sorry I'm not there with you personally, but I've had a medical family emergency to attend to. I want to thank the organizers for the invite, and specifically Joseph and Isabella for their flexibility and helping me out in terms of doing this recording. I hope it works for you. I want to start off by saying that the world's upside down and it's time to invert our thinking. And that's why we need a human rights economy. I'll explain during the talk what a human rights economy is and how it relates to sustainable development. You know, I heard a long time ago, I read an article that if you show a picture of a cat at the beginning of a speech, that somehow this is going to create a bit of empathy and people will be more open to what you're going to say. And because I need you to be open to what I'm going to say, I wanted to share a picture of my cat, Fela. Okay, sustainable development goals. Of course, sustainable development is a concept that is much wider than sustainable development goals, but the UN has attempted through these 17 goals to create specific areas where the world needs to make progress. There's measures and indicators. And if you look at them, they're all great. From no poverty, zero hunger, reduced inequalities, clean water sanitation. But we're not getting there. In fact, in 2023, the UN General Assembly painted a very bleak picture that not a single one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is on course to reach its target by 2030. And why is that? It's because Sustainable Development Goals are kind of like fashion. We change every few years. Before the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Millennial Development Goals. Also with a lot of attention, a lot of meetings, a lot of hype, but we didn't really get there. And why is that? Because, well, oddly, sustainable development is already the law. And we need to figure out why people are not following the law in order so that we can have sustainable development. Okay, here are two pictures of the previous High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations and the current High Commissioner for Human Rights. The previous being Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. I left my post in Colombia as the representative after the peace process with the FARC concluded, and I was moved to Geneva to work at headquarters, and I had in my portfolio about 50% of the thematic issues that the office deals with. All of those issues related to the economy and development were in my area. And when I was speaking to the High Commissioner, she was like, well, Todd, you're right. We need to actually get people to understand that development or sustainable development is already the law. We developed a concept called the human rights economy, which was to help remind people that there's already a legal framework that applies to the economy. But she was like, we need to figure out how do we create a consciousness about this. If I was to call a minister of finance somewhere and they would pick up, they would say, oh, Michelle, why are you calling? And they would think I'm calling because they put somebody in prison. She said, we need to have the ministers of finance or secretaries of treasury first think about, is their tax policy consistent with human rights? Are they regulating business in accord with human rights? Thus, we made progress in terms of a lot of written material, meetings, trying to create a consciousness that actually human rights was intended as guardrails for the economy, as all parts of society. When Volker Turk took office after Michelle Bachelet left, the conversation, he thought, this is what we need. We need to replace the Sustainable Development Goals with the human rights economy because it's already a legal obligation. It helps us actually bring us to a point where no longer can people just make as much money as they want by imposing unfreedoms and costs or human rights violations on others. Think about cancer, climate change. No. What a human rights economy is that you first respect the rights of others and then make as much money as you want. So, is this feasible? Can we really invert the way we think about the GDP or gross domestic product is so important and economic growth being so important and maximizing your income is so important? I think we can. Human rights applies to all political and economic systems. That's the way it was designed. Most countries have signed and ratified all relevant human rights agreements. The US, we've only signed the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. That is important. But we have signed and ratified the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which includes economic rights. Okay, so it's already legally binding, but it's widely ignored. That is the dialectic of human rights. You can see, I don't know, maybe you can't see, I hope you can see, and I thank the IT people for helping out. Here is a survey done by the Open Society Institute. It was the largest survey of its kind. It basically showed that human rights has a tremendous amount of positive public opinion support. 88% in Bangladesh. Most countries, well over 50%. The average, I think, was 72% favorability ratings. And the US was just about at that average. So we have a lot we can do with this. But we also have many challenges to get there. Okay. So what's the difference between the free market economy today and the human rights economy? Well, first of all, the free market is free for those that take best advantage of it, have the economic and political power to do so. Unfortunately, we've conflated concepts of self-interest with greed. Self-interest is not always about greed. Self-interest can actually consider where you are in a society and how you, as an individual or as a corporate entity, actually relate to others and how that relates to your own self-interest. I mean, think about driving down the wrong side of the road. We give up certain things in order to live in a society. And part of that was to respect the rights of others. I mean, the adage of, my rights end at your nose. I don't have a right to throw a punch at your nose. It's the same. How did we miss this in terms of the free market? The free market, if we looked at the human rights economy, is about human rights law providing guardrails for economic activity. You can only maximize your return to your investors after you respect the rule of law. How did human rights become not part of the rule of law? It is part of the rule of law, and we need to start understanding fiduciary duty like that. I think most people forget that Milton Friedman, who really was one of the people that pushed for the neoclassical free market or neoliberal economies, also spoke about the fact that, well, he didn't think that it was the role of businesses to build schools and to build healthcare centers. They thought that they should pay taxes and that the government should do that. And he also thought that they should respect the rule of law. But somehow we lost that. And we need to get back to understanding fiduciary duty to respect the rule of law and to maximize profit thereafter, not simply to maximize return to shareholders. Okay, why do I think that there is a possibility of the human rights economy to take off, and even in the United States? If we look at it, the relative income inequality that existed in the United States during the time of the American colonies, or the 13 colonies, was basically about the same as it was for us in that boom period after the 1940s, where the 1940s began with policies, specifically the Roosevelt policies, had a huge amount of unionism. And so what happened is during the 13 colonies, you had a gradual increase, because at first we had a very agrarian society, and you moved toward more manufacturing. Capital began to take more political and economic power, and you began to have a concentration of wealth. Then we had the big fall within the World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. And then you saw progressive policies that helped create really another boom for the US economy and for the global economy. But again, we ended up in basically at the end of the Carter regime, and the beginning of Reagan, we changed our understanding of what school of thought in economics we should use. Before we were using Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was about how do you create the well-being? How do you maximize the well-being for the population? And we moved to neoclassical, which makes an assumption that if you act in your own self-interest, well, that will then create benefits for society. Of course, self-interest can't be reduced to greed, but it has been. Okay, for some of you, you probably, I don't know if you can't see this, but I have Milton Friedman that was photoshopped here, Frederick Hayek and Adam Smith, into the Founding Fathers. Because if you were to read people today, it would somehow think that the neoclassical economics or free market economy is somehow the natural thing that's been happening, and the Constitution actually thought about it. That's absolutely crazy. What happened during the Constitutional Convention is you had people that had different ideas about how the economy should be generated and how much this should lead to the well-being of people. There was a lot of arguments about it, but nobody had an understanding of what would be today the free market capitalist economy. That's just not what they were talking about. And in fact, if we look at this, Adam Smith and Milton Friedman both spoke about the need to respect the rule of law. Okay, I don't have that much more time left. I wanted to move to just a couple of examples to show that, when we talk about self-interest, we look at companies, oftentimes we look at, if we dump these costs onto others, then somehow we're going to maximize our profit and we're going to be better off, and that somehow will magically produce benefits for society. I don't think it does. I think what we can look at here is Mineros S.A. It is a gold mining company in Colombia. I was in Colombia for about 8 years during the entire peace process between the government and the FARC, one of the rebel movements that ended successfully in a peace accord. It's had some difficulties in terms of implementation, but the reality has changed. 80% of gold mining today in Colombia is informal. These informal mines use mercury. Mercury has an incredibly bad impact on human health. And so those that live around these mines oftentimes end up with mercury poisoning. When we started to speak to Mineros S.A. about the need to think about their self-interest related to how they are a citizen within Colombia, and how they could actually, for their shareholders, produce more if they created more collaborative effort. And they were like, well, we don't get it. We said, look, one, often your people, when they go out into the field, are kidnapped. There's a bad relationship between you and the different rebel groups. You pay bribes in order to operate to the military. The people in town think that you do nothing because all they see is like this school that you built, and over here you gave some money for a health post. but they think that you just give money in terms of bribe the local officials and don't pay your taxes. And so what about thinking about addressing a problem and addressing it in a way that can actually help you in terms of your bottom line? This is a picture of some informal mining. You can see that it's quite easy for the, let's say, when they dig out what some, let's say, the earth that may contain some gold in it, they do the actual, it's not distilling, but the actual processing there. And then that mercury then leaches into the water system, affects the fish. The fish are eaten oftentimes by the local indigenous people that then end up with mercury poisoning. We said, look, you need to actually invest. You need to invest. We created a tripartite entity between community, the government, the local government, and Mineros SA said, well, you need to be transparent about how many taxes you're paying. And you need to also advocate that those taxes are used appropriately for investing in schools and investing in education and supporting the people in terms of saying, if this is what they're advocating for and this is what they think it should be using for, it will close down that idea of corruption. Second is that these communities are suffering from mercury poisoning. How do we actually create a relationship with the community that's done in a legal way, in accord with the law, that actually produces benefits for that community and avoids the use of mercury? It was possible. We were able to show that, in fact, through this effort, the community ended up getting better governance. The company had a better potential in terms of possible earnings, and the amount of environmental contamination was down. It required to rethink, to invert their thinking in terms of short-term growth to understanding that being a good citizen in terms of their self-interest could require investments, but those investments could pay off in terms of their bottom line over time. Here I wanted to speak just a couple more seconds because I know we're running out of time. I published an article in the major news magazine in Greenland in December. That's the cover of the magazine. Is that it was a tongue-in-cheek effort because I was saying, look, please help us when you're negotiating with the Trump regime. Say, we're happy to consider this, but we would like to see that all your people get the right to health and the right to other economic rights that we enjoy in Greenland. That we would like to also consider your offer once every U.S. citizen is able to vote, because you have many territories that currently do not have the right to vote. One of them including the U.S. Virgin Islands, that was a Danish territory and currently has no federal representation. And so the idea being is that, wait a second, there are a need for human rights guardrails. I mean, we're talking about Greenland as if it was terra nullius. We're going back to the idea that we just take things by force because we need their critical minerals or minerals. And this, of course, will only lead to some short-term gain, but long-term pain. I want to finish with just the idea and reinforcing that, markets can actually produce benefits for human rights, but they can also negate human rights. It's a silly idea to think that the market will solve all problems because it exists and it hasn't. We need to actually understand that the economy is something that's constructed. It's a construct. And how we construct that should be in the benefit of everyone and should be consistent with the human rights obligations that all states have. We need to stop moving away from this idea that somehow the economy and business is separated, like exist in this human rights free zone, and move it to something where human rights is a useful guardrail and produces a goal in which the economy can, together with human rights, produce benefits for everyone. And that would be sustainable development. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there with you. I want to thank you very much for your participation today, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thanks very much.
While Professor Howland cannot hear us, I thank you for your round of applause at the end. And we are extremely grateful that, again, in this time of difficulty with his family, our hearts go out to them from the whole team, that he still was able and willing to record this message to all of us. In my opinion, I really think that it sets a great vision of what the symposium is about, as well as what it means to be here at Vermont Law School. And really kind of when we talk about these broad aspirations for society and our role as lawyers within it. For right now, I ask you if you can stay in your seats, but we're going to do a quick transition into setting up for our next panel on sustainability in mining. Thank you. And then we'll be ready to go at 3:30. So now we're going to begin with our first panel, Transparency and Accountability for Sustainable Mining. This panel will be moderated by our very own Professor Mark James. And with us, we have Martine Thiobat and Andreas Chang. However, I will allow Professor James to give the full introduction, rather than spoil the thunder. We also, Professor Arturo Brandt also plans to join to us. Unfortunately, he's running late. So we are continuing with the panel as is. But yeah, we look forward to it. And then I'll also, just for everyone's awareness, at the very end, we'll have a period for questions. Me and Isabella Marie will have the microphones, and we'll be around when we get to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you to VJEL for putting on this event and for the invitation to participate in it. As Joseph was saying, I'm Mark James. I'm the interim director of the Institute for Energy and the Environment and an associate professor of law here. Nice to see so many familiar faces. I'm going to introduce my panelists, and I will actually let them do the honors of talking about where they've come from and what they're going to do. But one important thing that you will learn is that there are no Americans on this panel, and we will not really be focusing on in sustainable mining, looking at what's happening outside of the U.S. So that'll be one of the focus points that we're going to be looking at is what's happening in specific countries, and each of our guests will bring their own personal experience to that too. So to my immediate left is Martine Thiobat, and to his left is Andreas Chang. I'll lift Martine to give a brief introduction, and then we will pass it to Andreas.
Thank you, Professor. Just making sure this works. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the committee for the invitation. I'm happy to be here in Vermont this afternoon. So my name is Martin Thiobat. I'm a lawyer by training and practice. I also teach as a lecturer, energy and natural resources law in Quebec City in the province of Quebec. You may know Université Laval, that's where I teach. My professional work focuses primarily on environmental law, as well as municipal law and natural resources law. Many developments that we can see nowadays. I've been involved in the mining sector more specifically since the beginning of my career, approximately 12 years ago. So I advise both mining companies and other stakeholders on regulatory compliance, environmental risk management, and governance issues. So I've worked on matters ranging from environmental permitting, contaminated land management, and broader question in terms of project development, infrastructure, and environmental liability. And I've also served for a few years on the Mining Association of Canada's Environmental Committee. And I'm also interested in governance more generally. I sit on some boards of directors, and I think this has informed how I think about sustainability and mining in general. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be on this panel today. My name is Andreas Chang. I am a master's student at the University of Toronto in their School of the Environment. The reason that I'm here is partly to be representing the findings of my current research, which is exploring private governance systems in the mining sector and contention over mining, especially at the local level in relation to new projects and distributional conflicts over new and existing projects. But I also bring with me personal and professional experiences that predate my research into mining. Prior to beginning my master's degree, I worked in a UN-backed program for corporate climate targets for about 4.5 years. So I am going to be bringing with me some insight into what the corporate sustainability movement looks like from the inside. And after that, I transitioned to working as a senior researcher at Greenpeace USA, supporting campaigns focused on stopping the build out of US natural gas and protecting the right to protest. So in many ways, these two different positions from my professional life, being involved with a sort of UN-backed top-down governance program on one hand, and campaigning and advocacy to protect the rights of those who are protesting development projects on the other, puts me in a bit of a strange position where today I'll try to represent some of what I've learned through both. Thanks.
I heard that in magical teams, which means that Professor Arturo Brandt has joined us too. Arturo, if you could give us a short introduction to all of the many things that you do.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from Santiago de Chile, 10 kilometers away from you. I'm working today from home in an autumn day. Raining is coming today. I am Arturo Brand. I am a proud alumni at VLS. I got my LLM by 2003, 2002, if I can remember. I have been working in environmental issues for the last 20 years. Most of them focus on climate change, climate finance, carbon market, lastly on ESG. My main position is from the private sector. I have been advising mining companies as well as some intergovernmental United Nations organization and public sector. I work with some companies. I am a professor at VLS teaching during the summer global energy law and policy. I'm president of Environmental Law Association in Chile and a senior advisor of several think tanks, board of director of Kennedy Foundation, who takes care on wetlands. And again, I'm working on environmental climate change issues since 2004. Thank you for inviting me. Mining industry is a big thing in Chile. I will let you know later how and why I think that the copper and the mining industry has to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And glad to answer your question. And again, thank you for allowing me being with you.
Thank you, Arturo. So before we get started into talking about what's sustainable mining, I'd like we kind of do some level setting and think about just mining itself and what we have a need for. And Professor Howland had ended his presentation thinking had the term critical minerals on one of his slides. What does it mean to have a critical mineral? We hear that in the news, in policy at the federal level, I think we need to secure critical minerals. So what does that mean? Do we have enough of them? Is there a shortage of that? So I had gone and looked at the International Energy Agency publishes a Global Critical Minerals Outlook, which they published in 2025, and said, what's a critical mineral? They have copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite. You may hear about rare earth minerals, that there is increasing demand in those areas, and it's often driven by the need for electrification, whether it is creation for copper to use in new transmission lines, if it's rare earth metals to do in magnets that are then used in different applications to make computer circuits, transistors, all those things that have electric vehicles and battery storage and lithium, that those are the types of things that we are in need of, those type of minerals as part of our energy transition. They are a necessary element of it. We've seen lithium demand explode as batteries have become expanded into home delivery systems as well as the electrification of transportation. In China now, more than half of all of the cars that are built are battery cars. So that is the largest vehicle market in the world. So we're seeing lithium demand went up 30% in 2024 after seeing a 10% annual growth rate. That means, over the course of 7 to 8 years, you're seeing a doubling of what is needed. So Lots of demand anticipated by 2040, lithium up by 5-fold, copper up by 30%, cobalt, rare earth metals, 50 to 60% increases. And as I mentioned, that this is a panel that's going to sort of look outside of the US, and a lot of those resources are coming from other countries. China, Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, yes, Canada, the United States, South America, Chile, Peru, other places, and often they are concentrated in specific areas, whether it's cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia having significant nickel supply, copper in Chile, there's places in Canada, Peru, China. Same thing with lithium, again, coming back to Chile, which we'll hear Arturo talk about more expansively. But mining is also, it's not just the extraction of it, it's the refining of it, it's the processing of it. And if we're thinking about a supply chain, we should think about sustainability along that supply chain. There are smelters in Quebec, that are, some of the only smelters in Quebec that are handling, whether it's copper production too, and that comes with its own impact. So it might not be the community located where the mine is, but it's the community located where the processing is happening. And there are harms along each of those steps, and we should consider that when we think about mining as a whole. It's more than just digging something out of the ground. It is getting it to the point where it's ready to go into an application. Interestingly, in looking at that report, we see that, future production volumes are anticipated to supply most market needs. There are some resources like copper and lithium where there might be supply shortfalls. Question that we might come to later on is that how does recycling work into all of this too, and the ability to recapture those? So that's part of the design process, and also having facilities that can capture it and make it at a lower cost than producing virgin materials. So how do we make sure that we're balancing all of that out? If we have a circular economy, then how does that integrate into being sustainable and putting those practices first? So that sort of sets out what do we need for mined resources. It's, they are undergirding our energy transformation. But if we're going to do that, here's an opportunity to have sustainable mining. And I thought we would sort of start off with a discussion about defining that term and thinking about, what the motivations are of that of the sustainable mining movement, how its history, and sort of taking us to where we are today, and thinking about issues it's going to address. And we'll get into some of the details of sustainability and what does that mean to the parties who are participating in this particular practice. So would love to hear my panelists' thoughts on sort of the movement and how it's arrived here, and then we can talk about how do we define it.
Sure, I'm happy to go first in response to that question. So when I think of sustainable mining, I think of it as a movement because it's uncontroversially a movement. Whether the character of that movement is good or bad, how effective it has been is something that we can debate. But the roots of sustainable mining as a movement really traces back to the 90s. There is currently a major initiative of mining companies that have been advancing the idea of sustainable mining, which is intended to make mining more socially and environmentally sustainable, make it into a driver of sustainable development. That got its start in the late 90s with a convening of mining CEOs that were essentially responding to reputational crisis and the growing strength of an anti-globalization movement. So I think that this kind of history is important, and the fact that the sustainable mining movement has this long of a history is important because it should lead us to reflect on what has this movement actually achieved. So this is one way of answering the question. It's more of a historic look at what sustainable mining could be. But there's another side of sustainable mining, which is that what is it that we are trying to achieve, or that proponents of sustainable mining are trying to achieve? And rather than answer that, I think my panelists could probably take it from there or give whatever 2 cents they have.
Thank you, Andres. And yeah, I think the historic perspective is always important when discussing those large and broad topics such as sustainability. In my view, sustainable mining is at first addressing governance issues that have lasted for many years. And going further on the governance perspective, mining left significant externalities over the years, legitimacy deficits as well, accountability gaps. And so, the governance structure that is brought forward under various sustainable frameworks really aims at addressing those gaps. And we can come back on each of these aspects, how new frameworks, respond to those gaps more specifically. But I will left it here to leave it to Professor Arturo to comment further.
Yeah, so for the question, I have been doing some research before this presentation. I mean, as you know, I'm from Chile. Copper is a key place, a key actor on our economy. I will go there later on. But if I have to answer the question of sustainable meaning, I will answer the question of what is sustainable copper. As you know, Chile produced 28% of the copper around the world. And what does green copper mean? It means low carbon footprint. I mean, their high intensity use of energy. It means sustainable water use. They are highly intensive uses of water underground and overground, and this is a key issue on the copper mining in Chile. Also, they have to take care of less environmental impact regarding air particulate matter. They have a big issues in the communities surrounded the mining sector, and as well, they have been working on ESG issues. I have been advising some mining companies as well, other actors on the private sector, on how ESG can help to improve their sustainability issues. But the question is that when you go to a mining board, they have why we have to do sustainable, and they are looking at the price. When the price of copper is too high, like right now, they say, don't bother us. We need to keep producing, and we cannot stop even a minute because we are not getting more money. When the price is down, they say we don't have money to be sustainable because sustainability in the short term is more expensive, even though when in the long term it's cheaper and you can save a lot of money. But in terms of price, and this is very interesting fact that I just checked this morning, is who is buying green copper and who is selling green copper. 20% of our production is being bought by China. I mean, China really doesn't care about green copper. They just care about the price. And the impact of the price of being green at the copper industry is between 0.5 and 1.5% of total price production. This is nothing for the mining industry. And when you talk to them and say, well, you have to be sustainable, they say, why? And when they're thinking about financially speaking, they say, well, this is nothing. We can try to do something, but who cares about green copper? Europe. Europe represents, in the case of Chile, almost 20% of our copper production. Most of them goes to Germany, and then we have an issue. And also another issue is that, I mean, the certification, the green copper certification is not mandatory, and there's not a universal standard being accepted by everybody. And then you can go for greenwashing and you can, the mining industry is very aware of bad press. And if there's not universal standard commonly accepted, they prefer to refrain from being green, as well as the financial aspect, which I think that is very important for them.
Thank you, Arthur. I don't know if anyone has anything they wish to add on to after hearing other panelists.
Yeah, so Professor pointed to specific components of sustainability, so impact on water, etc. But I think sustainability is also around the acceptability of a project from a social standpoint. And in that sense, it goes beyond the value of the minerals. And I would add that for many mining companies, in order to get their project financed, they also have to show a certain level of sustainability. So yes, the price of the commodity will have an impact on whether the project will be feasible. But before going to the market, just to have the project built, in some cases, a company will have to show that it is sustainable in some respects.
And that's what if anyone wanted to provide any commentary, just to, again, sort of a little more background, is to understand the structure of the mining industry and how it works. I know that they're being Canadian, a lot of it, if you are a large mining company, you have a presence there because there is the financing structure that is there too. But that might mean that, there are multinational companies that the Rio Tintos and other entities that are operating globally. But how is there a general structure to the mining industry, whether it is in Chile or operating in Canada or in the US, about major players and where their money comes from and what rules and regulations they might be subject to?
Well, in Canada, typically a mining project will go through several stages before the minerals can actually be marketed, and obviously sustainability will have a different meaning or scope depending on where you are on that trajectory. But even, exploration work may have an impact on the environment. So sustainability also applies to exploration work, and host communities will have expectations even from that very early stage. So in my view, sustainability is something that a company should have in mind from the very beginning of the project. And this will inform the various planning stages that will follow.
Some aspects of the mining industry that I think really inform my understanding of what sustainable mining means is that it's an extremely concentrated industry, and mines as a kind of development project require a massive amount of capital input, more and more capital input as mineral resources become depleted. So when I think about sustainability, I'm thinking, yes, about some of the key issues that we've discussed already, like water and air pollution and the acceptability of a project. But what does it mean for an industry to be sustainable in the way that it's structured? Who holds power and who is actually a shareholder in a project, for example? And I don't have any answer to what it would look like for an industry that is so concentrated to become more sustainable in light of those characteristics. But those characteristics, I think, really play into what seems to be possible and what some of the major challenges are when you have such powerful actors.
So sort of build off of that and think about, with those actors, what is sustainability. There are norms to which are a reflection of, whether it's top down or bottom up pressures. There are regulations, as Professor Howland is talking about. We have companies, countries that have agreed to certain human rights treaties. There are their own country statutes, and then there are private governance systems. So if we can kind of begin to sort of pull apart what it is. And I give you an example. In doing some research, look at there are how do you begin to measure it, and that's often a reflection of what you're asked to do. So there can be key performance indicators, and there can be specific things on water, air pollution, but there might be community engagement. So how are those informed by a company that's going to operate in an area, and it has to deal with norms, it has to deal with regulations, it has to deal with its own private governance systems? People can pull that apart for us, please.
Well, I mean, no, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that compliance with regulations should really be the baseline when we're discussing sustainability, and then what's more than mere compliance will depend on a number of factors, but please go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of sustainability, I would say that, I mean, there's three main drivers. One of them is a mandatory regulation. Chile has a very highly standards for mining sector. We have to go through environmental impact assessment, which is not easy. Sometimes it takes between 5 and 10 years. It takes a lot of times, you know. Then there's a voluntary standards being setting up, but mainly by international companies who ask the local branches to follow international standards. I'm talking about example BHP. And also there's some market demand. I mentioned that, I mean, Europe is asking for green copper. The London Exchange metal also is developing like a sort of a standard. And I mean, I think that this is the three main drivers in Chile. I also think that it's important to let you know that in Chile can be different than other places. I mean, the mining industry is in the very north part of Chile, which is in the middle of nowhere. I was talking with a neighborhood who works in the mining industry, and he was telling me that in the north of Chile, where the mining industry is working, there's not even an ant, you know? It's a very arid places. Most of them are in the middle of the Atacama Desert, which is the highest desert in the world. And then that environmental issues in the case of copper in Chile are different because they are not in a very highly populated places or in a very delicate ecosystems. I mean, the main issues there are related with the water consumption underground. There's not communities around the mining sector. And then I say that, I mean, environmental issues are not the main issues that affect other mining sectors all around the world, let's say in Africa, for example, or in Canada or in United States.
Yeah, I totally agree that the key issues will really depend on where the project is located. So obviously some frameworks may be adopted by a broad range of companies, but how they will be meaningfully implemented will really depend on the minerals that we're talking about, how close communities are, and other aspects.
Something that was spoken about earlier, which I think is interesting to reflect on, is where some of the demand for sustainability is coming from and how that gets propagated through the supply chain. So like Arturo was mentioning, a lot of demand for green minerals and sustainability comes from Europe, and specifically from downstream purchasing companies, large purchasing companies like car companies, BMW, Mercedes-Benz. They have sustainable purchasing programs that are largely meant to mitigate those companies' own risk. So when we talk about mining companies going beyond the minimum requirements of the law, it's often dependent on these private systems of governance, which will require audits, for example, kinds of disclosure and reporting, and potentially environmental mitigation that goes beyond the kinds of EIAs. One of the issues with this type of approach is that the sanctions can be very weak, or you're relying on market demand basically, and audits that some people question to deliver on these aims. So,
and I was going to pick up on that point, the reporting obligations too, and again saying that if there are 25 major mining companies in the world, that 10 of them or 85% of them have agreed to disclose performance across 10 key environmental and social indicators. Are they all agreeing to the same sort of program, or are they're developing their own internal reporting obligations, or is there third party involvement in what's
I would love
define a private governance system?
Yeah, I would love to answer this. There is a piecemeal universe of lots of different certification schemes out there, different kinds of standard setters and industry codes of conduct. And in a way, they're all competing with each other as well. So they have to compete on two different bases. One is the legitimacy and the credibility of the rules that they're setting. So they have to be credible enough that they make sense to the observer in civil society or the purchaser. But they also need to compete for the companies to take them up. So we might talk a little later about some of these different standards. They vary quite substantially in the cost that they impose on companies. But if they're too costly and they're too rigorous, then the mining companies themselves can form a block and essentially choose not to opt in. So this is one of the major structural weaknesses, but I'll leave it at that.
And are we seeing an evolution in the norms that that are being applied to, like with attention coming to, I think right now I'm thinking of like Democratic Republic of Congo, and there being issues there too, and that is sort of the unstructured individual mining too versus mining companies themselves too, or just to make sure that we're differentiating between those two. Those are two entirely different types of practices, although both of them can feed raw materials into the same system. So is there different ways to improve sustainability at that individual informal mining sector? I know we had no discussion about this question, but it popped in my head and I thought it was interesting. We talked about mining companies, but outside of that in that informal sector, is there anything to target those areas? If anyone has anything to.
Mark, I mean, let me interrupt you, but I think that your issue is very, very important. We have to make a difference. In all of industry, it happened the same thing. Big industry, multinational company, they have money sort of to take care of the environment, to take care of the sustainability issues. However, if you're going back one step down, a medium, small companies, it's not that they don't want to, they don't have money to. I mean, as Andres just told us, I mean, to get certification to be carbon neutral or to ESG, whatever, you need money. And companies ask you, how much money does it cost to be certified? And then you have to make a difference why they don't use and they don't apply to those standards, but however they want to. But I mean, small companies, I mean, they just are striving to survive, It doesn't happen with multinational. When they have money, they have sustainability officials, they participate in seminars, whatever. There's a big difference, And the real world's open like that. It's not like everybody has money to do whatever they want to do.
Arturo, I have a response to that, which is that I think this is such an important question, is do these standards and these costly processes, because they are costly and a lot of the medium and smaller companies cannot adhere to them, do they actually make a difference in the ground level activities and practices that these companies are driving forward? Because a lot of the impetus for mining companies to behave sustainably is actually because they don't want to lose their social license to operate, which is a term that is referring to basically not being shut down by the community. So this is where my thesis research is actually going to be focused. Hopefully I'll get to shine a light on the extent to whether they actually are serving their purpose.
I would add that I've seen large companies developing internal programs to help their suppliers, including in the mineral area. So not only requiring their suppliers to comply with certain sustainable expectations, but also helping them getting there. So not perfect, and it's not for everyone, but I've seen this.
And do we see the use of the private governance systems then informing the mandatory regulations? Is there a relationship between the two of those in which the adoption of a normative practice in the industry then is subsequently reflected in changes to the mandatory obligations and sort of to do a raising the floor in what is deemed to be sustainable, and sort of to try and generate a process that is always moving forward with its concept and application of what is sustainable?
I can't say I've witnessed this specifically in Canada, but I can say for sure that at the Mining Association of Canada, where they developed a rigorous program called Towards Sustainable Mining, companies, once they comply with this program, they would like it to become mandatory to distinguish themselves from competitors or other jurisdictions. Yeah.
Well, in the case of Chile, I'm not sure. I don't have a final answer if they are waiting for regulation or they aim to change the regulation. I mean, sometimes they move forward before the regulation happen, because in any case, if they don't have natural resources, they cannot work on it. That's why they take care of the water. In Chile, we have 32 desalination plants in the north of Chile, and 85% of those desalination plants are working for the mining industry, because they already realize that they don't have water, they don't have business. And some of them have compromised on a voluntary basis to do not use underground water behind the mining industry, and that's something is very important. I have been talking with some executives at private sector who say, if we don't take care of the natural resources, our business is gone. And that's some driver that is they are using to move forward too, in my experience.
There are some examples of governments actually taking commodity certifications, sustainable commodity certifications, and sort of embedding it into law and importation policy. So I don't think that Europe is doing this right now for sustainable minerals, but for timber imports, for example, I believe that they, in certain cases, require due diligence, and they accept private sector certifications as evidence of sustainability. I don't think that that's necessarily the right approach, because it just keeps more, it just kind of keeps putting more into an accountability relationship that is very issue prone. But in other areas like free, prior, and informed consent, I do think that some of the sustainability initiatives and standards are contributing in a really positive direction to the uptake of norms. And one of the roles that they play is getting businesses together to sort of incrementally and gradually self-socialize to accept these norms, which might make them easier to put into law.
Thank you. I'm going to come pick up on the free, prior, and informed consent. And one of the things we've been talking about, the mining companies themselves, we've talked about the government. I think we also want to shine some attention onto the communities themselves. And I think that comes back to also social license, which we've been discussing too, about acceptance of the project, differences in, not just procedural engagement, perhaps some distributive changes in how historic practices have happened to be able to engage with communities, but also provide direct benefits with them too. And how is the sustainability model, engaged with a different relation, or trying to produce a different relationship with impacted communities?
Well, in the case of Chile, I mean, as I said you before, the copper industry is very important. It represents 40% of our GDP. It can be until 20%, 55% of our exportations, and in some regions represent 70% of the employment. 1/7 of the total investment in Chile goes to the mining sector, and the mining sector pay 48% of the royalty out of their income to contribute with local communities. We are far away from the perfect situation, but I think that we're working on that. I mean, they provide sources of new and more intensive work among the communities. And as I said before, when you have a community where 70% depend on the mining sector, I mean, the benefit is already there. On a global level, I think that there's much thing that we have to do. You go to the north of Chile in some places and has a very poor cities surrounded by big trucks and big mining, and we have to work on that. But in general terms, I think that they are working, moving forward in order that the communities see the real benefits inside and not just moving to the capital city of Santiago. But this is a big complaint that everybody is telling. I mean, why the money from the mining sector? You see the benefits in the big cities and not in the small city where the copper is being produced.
Well, in Canada, procedural fairness has definitely been integrated in the regulatory framework. So when it comes to mandatory early engagement consultation, we even have specific requirements for First Nations, which have been historically more impacted by mining. There is also, I would say, significant progress when it comes to distributive justice, not necessarily from the regulatory framework, but from how companies approach the communities in terms of opportunities for employment, like Arturo mentioned, and other forms of benefits to the communities. I would say it's more on a case-by-case basis, though, depending on the community needs, their main concerns. So on the procedural aspects, definitely, it's now embedded in the regulatory framework. And in terms of distributive justice, it's more under private arrangement, at least in Canada.
It seems to me like you really do need strong laws and strong enforcement to ensure that community firm relationships are fair and equitable, and that very little is going to come from voluntary commitments in that regard. But you could call me cynical. I do think the topic of community firm relations is very complex because communities are not a monolith, and often within a community you have different blocks and different opinions. So if you do leave it up to the company or the state, if it's a pro-mining state, to facilitate this kind of trust-building process or informed consent, you will, with current sustainable mining practices, probably see improvements compared to 20 years ago, in that there is better quality information sharing and that there is more respect. But you can also see mining companies take advantage of the fact that there are fragments within communities and across communities that are impacted, because any one of these projects is going to have such broad impacts if it's a large-scale mine.
I would add that capacity building is something that is more and more top of mind. So giving those communities the resources to be able to understand their issues, to express them more clearly, and then engage in a more equal dialogue. So and in some cases it comes directly from the government in Canada. So giving the resources to the community so that they can prepare and bring something of better quality to the consultation, etc.
And on that point about consultation, there's a series of Supreme Court cases in Canada that have changed the relationship or have clarified the relationship between the federal government and a duty to consult with First Nations groups too. And that has obviously, with that being put in place, cases which took 20 years to litigate and involved massive amounts of resources and time to arrive at that there's an obligation, contained within our charter that is present there, our constitution that is present there and that in itself, when companies see that, they're saying, how do we avoid potential problems and how do we get out in front to do that too? So to come back to that idea of the willingness to engage is often driven by how quickly can you advance your business model and get to a point where you have a return on investment. And if it becomes a mitigation, it's a mitigation measure in order to do that engagement with communities. So I want to sort of take the time that we have left before we go to questions and think about, what are some of the things that the question we had framed out was, what should happen and by whom? So if we think about sustainability as an evolving concept, so where we are right now, that what is for mining companies, what should governments, regulators, communities, we've heard about the role of procurement and purchasing companies, if there are nonprofits who are engaging with us too, what are things that those entities can be engaged in, both expanding the use of sustainability practices and reporting, but also enhancing or improving those practices? So if there's anything within your areas of expertise where you're like, here's something that is good but could be done wider, or here's something that's good but could be done better.
Well, there's a trend for sure around legislation having an impact abroad. So, for example, in Canada, we have a new legislation on forced labor requiring Canadian companies to report on their supply chain. So I think we'll see more of that, and it will force companies in richer countries to do their due diligence before working with third parties abroad. So this is something from a regulatory legislative standpoint that I see evolving.
I have two responses to that. The first is that I do think that these systems of private governance, certification schemes, as an example, are sometimes overlooked because they're viewed as superficial, but they do often end up influencing policy downstream or even being integrated into it. So I think attention to these is important. I also think that at the end of the day, a lot comes down to communities and the power of communities. And Martine mentioned this with respect to capacity building, but also when you look at what communities have had the power and the capability to influence project, to be negotiators in how a project is developed and carried out. Often it is communities that are highly networked and that have connections to social movements, that are supported by scientists who can actually sort of challenge the monopoly that these companies have on scientific knowledge. And so thinking about how you support communities that are impacted by mining is really important. And not all communities that are opposing a mining project are doing it because they will never accept the terms of mining. Often they are opposing a project because they're getting a raw deal.
Finally, in my opinion, it's very important, as I said before, the role of buyers. If we see buyers, especially in China, asking for more sustainability items to be fulfilled by sellers, we will move forward. I mean, China demands 50% of the total copper around the world, and I think that the key for Chinese buyers is very important. If they move ahead, everybody will follow them. Also, I think that it's important to talk and to get involved with high-level executives of the mining industry and let them know that sustainability is a key element in profits. I mean, sustainability and profit should go hand by hand. I see that in Chile, sometimes medium and some high level companies use sustainability for, public relation, and they try to keep chatting and talking what they do and pay a lot of advertisement in a very costly press. But at the end of the day, I don't think that this idea is not a public relation issue. It's an issue which is very linked with profitability.
Are there examples, and if a company's promoting or proposing a project of obligations to support communities and the things that you were mentioning, Andres, where they have to provide independent experts, provide people who can help them negotiate, navigate what are very complex processes for doing environmental impact assessments, perhaps which can include a social impact assessment or trying to deal with communities. Are there examples of places that require that, or private governance systems that reward that sort of practice?
Well, I do know that in terms of the institutional characteristics of some of these certification schemes, there are those that tend to involve more independence and those that allow the companies to have more control. So, for example, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA, which many of the auto companies use, I think that while it still requires mining companies to pay their auditors, which is a conflict of interest, the mining companies have to cycle between different auditors and different cycles. So there's less of an opportunity for material conflict of interest to spoil that process. But really what I was talking about was what's happening at more of a grassroots level. And in Peru, you do see community collectives of sort of grassroots environmental monitors that are trying to collect data on mining projects so that they themselves are producing the knowledge and are better informed. So, yeah.
Yeah, we saw a few examples of residents of a community hiring their own consultant in the province of Quebec, and this is something quite new, right? Not so long ago, opponents did not have access to the same level of information, but those examples are more reactive than proactive, meaning that the projects was already approved when the residents decided to collect data. It's not to say it had no impact. They were able to make some things move or require better enforcement by the government, but it was still a little late in my view.
Thank you. Just trying to get there. I'm going to come back to if there's anything more to add into this idea of that they are the countries where the mining occurs and the countries where the companies are headquartered. And I think this is an important part to mention because of the global structure of the industry itself, that actions, whether I heard Arturo mention BHP or Rio Tinto, where multinational companies headquartered in one location with operations across the globe. And what is if there's any more to add in that relationship between accountability at where you're headquartered and how that might affect operations and where you are mining or extracting, refining those resources?
Well, there is a push for the home state of these companies to have more that can hold their companies accountable for any kinds of issues or crimes that are found overseas. So, for example, Mining Watch, which is an NGO based in Canada, has a push right now for the government of Canada to enact binding human rights and environmental due diligence legislation that would be applicable to Canadian organizations operating abroad, and establish civil liability, allowing plaintiffs to have their case considered on its merits in Canada. So I'm not a legal expert, but I leave that to you. But that's kind of the direct response that I wrote in my notes for this.
Thank you.
Well, it also happened in Chile. It's a very good point that is being raised by Mark. Best professionals, best lawyers, consultants, engineers are coming from the mining industry because they pay higher salaries, and they ask for high salaries. Normally mining communities around the mining sectors have been working with NGOs, with local small lawyers, and the level of playing field is not the same. We haven't found any solution, but I think that it's something really fair to work on that, because it cannot be like the best lawyers against a very local community lawyer, or a very poor local NGO. It's even worse. I mean, and there's something that we have to work on that. And also somebody also mentioned the level of information that is being managed by the big mining industry is totally different that the local ones have, and there's something that we have to work on. I fully agree with that.
The question that we had sort of agreed to come down to is thinking about, can mining, after all this discussion, can mining be sustainable, or is it going to be less unsustainable? That if we're going to, if we've demonstrated that there's a need to continue to extract and refine and process these materials to put them to use, that is this something that we can achieve a sustainability into it, or are we simply looking to do harm mitigation going forward? save the easy one for the end.
Well, you mentioned, Professor, the circular economy and the need to invest more in recycling. So we've definitely not reached the potential. It is very complex. I can speak for Quebec, where a very promising company was to recycle batteries. It just didn't work from a commercial standpoint, to the disappointment of several stakeholders. So more work on this front.
Recycling is also not an environmental justice panacea either, because these recycling facilities come with their own pollution and toxic risks. So I think that we need to be wary of thinking that it will have too much of an offsetting impact. I mean, the question of whether or not mining can be sustainable comes down to sustainable for who or for whom. And I don't think that there will ever be a mining industry that is sustainable for everyone. And I think that what needs to happen is a focus on energy demand side mitigation as much as possible, but that's not going to change the fact that we need more mining either.
Well, that's a very tough question. I don't have a final answer for that. I mean, I think that we have to work on some sustainability issues like recycling, greenhouse gas emissions. Tailing dams is another big issue. In Chile, we have more than 800 tailing dams that we have to work on that. But I think that we have to move forward in the real world and being brutally honest. As soon as we show them that to be sustainable is to get more money, as soon as we can show them some case studies that this is the right way to go, I mean, we will move forward faster. Other way, we will keep talking in circles, I mean, and they will keep asking you, well, show me the money, why I should do that.
At this time, I think we will, if there are questions, see Joseph and Isabella emerging here. So if you have a question.
There's someone at the front.
We need to do that. It's for the live stream we need.
Hi. So it's a two-part question because I want to make sure first that I mostly just clarifying that I understood this correctly. I don't really know anything about commodity pricing, but I think I understood that basically like having whatever various green sustainable certification can get you maybe 0.5 to 1.5% more, and was that right? Just
Arturo commented on this.
Is it right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so it sounds like the reason to have one of those certifications is because there are people who will only buy, or companies who will only buy something that's, green. Why is that? Because, I'm thinking about I don't know, organic chicken, right? I have no idea the number, but I'm guessing at least 20, 25%, higher cost. I mean, is it because commodities are more limited, and why is that economy in terms of the price of a green certification so much less? That might be way too big of an economics question.
No, I think that's a very fair question. It's not my area of expertise, but I suspect that I have at least some insights. I mean, there's very little consumer exposure to many of these minerals and metals. And for those where there is more commercial exposure, consumer exposure, you might actually see more penetration. So for example, gold, gems, diamonds. If you've ever been jewelry shopping, then you probably see these certifications in stores. But the car companies that are driving a lot of demand for certification are very price sensitive because the auto industry is just not doing so well generally, is my understanding. And there are a limited number of sectors that actually that care about this issue. Do others have anything to add?
Well, in the case of EVs, I think that they are moving faster and they are growing faster because it's like, again, it's financially attractive to have an EV after certain kilometers or miles that you drive, you know. After that, it makes sense. I mean, to have a EV, because I would like to save the world, it doesn't make sense in a normal person, you know, yeah. But if you tell them that after, let's say, 300K on a week, it makes financially sense, they will move forward, you know, easy.
I have a question for Professor Arturo. I'm curious if Chile is undergoing any measures to reduce its reliance on revenue from mining projects, if it's trying to diversify its economy at all, or if it's just focused on implementing more sustainable mining practices.
Well, I mean, as I said before, the copper industry contributes with 25% of our, sorry, it's not 25, it's 30% of global GDP, in some cases 20%. And the more copper that we produce, the more money we will get. Right now, there's Professor James tell that the demand for copper will duplicate in 2040. I mean, for us, and for the decarbonization around the world, more copper means more money. And I think that mining industry is growing and growing and growing. And there was an environmental impact assessment presented by one of the biggest companies in the United States, in Chile, which means that the biggest in investment in all the times, which means that we have been lucky to have a lot of copper because this world needs more copper to move toward decarbonization, you know?
Hi. So I'm wondering, like, something I'm hearing a lot from like the panel is just the structure of the mining industry is like a colonial structure. It's one of extraction of outside companies going into companies all over the world, but many global south companies or countries, and extracting those resources and taking them to like global north countries. And like that is where the capital and the money is sort of made and being extracted to, and the value is being brought to. So I guess I'm wondering if like, and also the accountability issues that come with this structure of extraction and colonialism. And so has there been any like efforts towards like locally owned sustainable mining? It seems like as harmful as mining just like inherently may be, by having like the communities who house the mines own the mines, like that could be one solution. And if that has been seen anywhere.
Well, I can say for sure that in the province of Quebec, there are governmental fund. So the Quebec government is a shareholder of some companies. So this has a direct impact on the governance. Typically, the government will have a seat on the board of those companies. It doesn't resolve all issues, but I can say that, yeah. So in that case, the government identified key minerals and will decide to invest to support some of the projects it believes are well, acceptable, but also relevant in light of the critical mineral context we discussed earlier.
It's a great question, and it's also a question that I am wondering about. But Bolivia, for example, is an interesting country in that it sort of rejected foreign mining investment or set up more barriers than some of its neighbors based on the precept that foreign mining investment is a kind of neo-colonial system. But the state itself, the government is still very pro-mining, and so you still have some of the same issues occur. So not an answer, but maybe something else to think about.
Well, thank you so much for this panel. It's been really interesting. But I have to say, when I read like the name like sustainable mining, it sounds like dissonant, like in a way like greenwash term. Because of the urgent economic, environmental, ecological crisis that we're living, and because it has not worked so far. So what do you guys think about other terms or other approaches like the degrowth of the economy? And in terms of like, yeah, that will be my first question. And then the second one is like, one of the arguments, when speaking about the community, how you can benefit the community, is that you're giving them jobs. But what kind of jobs are you giving them? And are you guys also worried about those rights for those workers? And what Catherine said before is actually the reality in the global south, in Latin America. Canadian companies, big corporations extracting and leaving nothing but jobs, these kind of jobs for them, and then all these environmental and nature crises that affects animals, nature, humans, and I don't know. I'm just very anxious about our planet.
Excuse me, Professor James, I have to leave. I mean, let me start with a short answer to the gentleman that asking. I think that the degrowth is totally 100% the wrong answer. In Latin America, we need more investment. We need keep growing because we still have people living in Chile at 10% living out of poverty, and that people needs to grow. Investment is necessary for us to grow, to build more houses, more hospitals, more, places where the people can and do different activities. I mean, and mining industry is not perfect, of course. They have a lot of issues to be resolved that I have mentioned, but the right answer is not the growth. The right answer is to attract investment, should fulfill the environmental standards, and to keep growing and to keep working with communities. I'm sorry, guys, but I have to leave. I have people waiting for me in another meeting. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope that I was useful for your doubts. And if you have any question, please, you can contact me directly. Professor James has my contacts. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Just on the degrowth issue, I think that Andres had raised this thing. We have to think about demand. That we are going to see an increase in. There's a need for additional mining of resources. The question then becomes, how big is the need itself, and are we taking appropriate measures in order to, on the demand side, to restrict that to what is necessary in order to achieve a variety of different goals, whether they are economic, environmental, social, what they're going to do too. So as Professor Brandt was saying too, yes, there are communities that will benefit from growth, and there are communities and countries that are receiving, the largest share of those particular materials. So how much growth is necessary is a question to be debated, and obviously that then requires a different set of regulatory, legislative, and policy approaches to manage what is actually necessary to make the recycling part feasible, to require standards so that you have interoperability of different resources, that you have the ability to use them for a second life or a third life, and then convert them back into it too. For example, the Tesla EVs, which have a battery that's integrated into the frame, which makes it incredibly difficult to get it back out and then begin to take processing, to do processing of that and to return it into a different usable form. So those sort of things from the sort of cradle to grave approach are the basis of circularity. And we have not, on a wide basis impose those principles upon the design and use of materials in a way that encourages them to be deconstructed and then reused. I think we have one more question, maybe two more questions, and we'll deal with this.
Hello. Hi. I was just wondering, having now recently stayed for the Food and Ag clinic here on campus, are issues of market consolidation plaguing the mining industry? Is in the last 20 years, have the mining companies actually decreased because of large mergers? Thank you.
So decreased in terms of absolute numbers? Yeah, there has been a consolidation. I'm not sure I'm able to comment on what's been the impact on sustainability. I think it depends on which companies merged and which culture emerged from the consolidation. So I would not say I'm not prepared to say consolidation has been a factor in more or less sustainability. I think more research would be required.
Want to do one more question?
Oh, thank you. So Mr. Chang, you mentioned in the 90s, there was a reputational crisis that some of the CEOs of mining companies were responding to. And I'm curious about, first, what that reputational crisis was. And second, are those pressures still alive? And can we rely on those same types of pressures to kind of encourage sustainable mining, if that can be possible? And if there's a concrete example, I'd love to hear of that as well. Thank you.
A concrete example of what exactly?
I'm thinking about communities who have successfully lobbied or successfully been able to show and encourage the owners or the managers of these companies through a reputational harm. So I'm just curious about what would impact and what would incentivize this type of change, building on that framework of like reputational harm. Like what encourages the companies to act better?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that the convening of CEOs that led to the International Council on Mining and Metals, which is a major player in the sustainability movement, was partly related to the mining industry's own sort of history, its association with environmental destruction, displacement, human rights violations, all of that good stuff, but also the broader sort of move toward corporate sustainability that was happening across sectors at the time. So also in sectors like apparel and agriculture, dealing with lots of different issues. And the common historical account is that mining executives got together and they realized that it was in their best interest to address this head on through seemingly genuine efforts to improve the industry's sustainability, because all of them are at risk when there is even just one bad actor, because a mining crisis picks up a lot of news. I mean, you can have hundreds of people killed by a tailings dam collapse, which is the waste from a mine site. Is that pressure still alive today? I don't think that the movement that is opposing the mining industry, because a lot of this was anti-mining activists, I don't think that movement is as strong. And among the sort of critical scholarship community, there are those who actually question the very sort of promotion of sustainable mining on the basis that it greenwashes the mining industry and could weaken that pressure.
Are you cutting me off?
I think we had two quick questions. If they're quick, I think we can get through them. I think Isabella, and then we'll come here.
this question sort of leads on the last one, but now that the mining industry is so associated with clean energy, which is something that environmental activists want, have you seen sort of a change either in like the market players like within companies, or with new companies entering the market, or even with like the NGOs who are willing to challenge mining projects now that there's sort of such like a climate crisis glaze on critical minerals and mining?
I've heard that there's been discussions inside some NGOs, absolutely, to reposition themselves. What should their key priorities be in light of this new need for minerals? So for sure, it has happened, at least in Canada, over the last 3 years.
I'm going to give a comment. You talked about the mining coming to the clean energy industry. You also have the clean energy sector moving to mining, and I think Andre said that you get a interaction of cultures, and you have to determine who's going to be the winning part on that too. The same way that if the energy industry has moved to the clean energy industry, there are historic players in there too who still have an extractive mindset with it too. That the combination does not always mean that the preferred, more sustainable option is the one that wins out. That there are longer term objectives and things that need to be paid attention to through both the non-actors, the third-party groups who are going to be there and being overseeing it too, but also to ensure that there's a continued pressure to improve that and not say that we're going clean, because it still requires a massive amount of moving dirt and earth and doing those sorts of practices too. And that way it comes back to the question of less unsustainable. If you just change the outcome for what it's going to be used, does that really change the impact upon which is felt by those communities that host these different types of facilities? So a change in perception is not always a change in practice. And I think that's the reason to have continued vigilance in all of those areas. And it also is to be aware of things of, what does express permitting mean? If we're seeking to streamline permitting or making things, a critical mineral strategy that's put forward, like what does that actually mean? And is it a way for entities to achieve long sought goals of lesser regulatory burdens because the cause has gotten better? Again, it always requires investigation and paying attention to it, those particular issues.
Real quick.
Hey, thanks for sitting on this panel and speaking with us today. I wanted to talk about, you expressed the importance of building community relationships where there's mutual beneficial impacts to both the community and the company. In large companies, it seems that they just kind of offer jobs, and that's kind of like the baseline, and they expect the communities to be happy. One thing that the Energy Clinic on campus has been researching is community benefit agreements and good neighbor agreements. And I wanted to get your perspective on what you have seen has worked in the past and has been beneficial, and then things that haven't been.
Well, I recently attended a conference by a former chief of a First Nation community in Quebec. And one thing that they are now looking for is not only impact benefit agreement, but also to participate in the profits. So this is really a next level of dynamic for those communities. And it's not, what I've seen at least, it's not only jobs, because once an individual has competence, after the project is gone, that individual can do something else. And we've seen that in one community in Quebec, in the northern Quebec. So since the 1970s, there's been an agreement between the governments and the communities. And we really saw expertise being developed within the community, so that now the community is present in different industries by itself. So it may have a very long-lasting impact when a community is involved in the right way.
Well, with that, we'll continue to look for the right way and move things forward. And that's something that you guys get to do too. So I want to thank my panelists, Arturo, who had to leave, but to Andres and Martin, thank you for coming here and sharing your experiences and your expertise.
So we're going to proceed with our next panel, which is Valuing Forests, the Role of Ecosystem Services, with Professor Janet Milne serving as our moderator. And then with our wonderful panelists, Yan Mei Lin, Zach Border, and Sheng Sun. And well, I'll let Professor Milne take it away.
But before you leave, we might have a clicker issue.
Oh.
Do we need to?
I don't know if. Oh, there we go. There we go. It's working. It's working.
Okay, great. We had to officially reach start time, I guess.
There we go.
So welcome to the panel. I'm Janet Milne, a professor here and director of the Environmental Tax Policy Institute. It's great to have so many people here on a Friday late afternoon. That's a real tribute to your interest in this topic. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together. I'm delighted that forestry is on the agenda with the broader topic of sustainability. We live in the middle of forests here in the Green Mountain State. They're all around us, but forests span the globe. And whether locally or internationally, globally, they produce tremendous positive impacts for the ecosystem. So take a moment, just 5-10 seconds, and in your mind, think of your favorite forest, your personal favorite. 5 seconds should do it, right? Okay, so you've got that forest in mind. So when we think about forests, we often think about their beauty, we think about recreational uses of them, we appreciate them on a daily basis. But what we're thinking about today is what are the other kinds of services that forests give to the ecosystem and to society? Forests stand there and they do a lot of work for us, just very silently. It's part of what they do, but it's also, I think, most times very undervalued by society for what forests really do to help support the ecosystem. And so that's our challenge for today, to really think about what are these ecosystem services that forests provide and what's the value of those services. So when we think about the value of ecosystem services, those values can be quantitative or they can be qualitative. And economists have done an amazing job at coming up with very sophisticated models to try to attach dollar values to the very quiet ecosystem services that forests provide. That's really important because it helps people think about what's the real value that's out there that the market does not recognize. So what is it that we're getting that we're not paying for on a daily basis? That's the quantitative side. But because we're a school of law and policy, we'll be looking more today at the qualitative side. So fear not, we won't inflict a lot of complicated economic models on you, but we'll think about what are the real services to the ecosystem that forests provide in different ways depending on the forest, and what can we do through law and policy to try to protect those ecosystem services. And that may involve some financial aspects like payments for ecosystem services. So not totally devoid of the quantitative side, but that's an important facet. So to summarize the challenge for today, it's really what can we do through law and policy to really recognize the importance of the real value that forests provide for the ecosystem and to society when the marketplace does not do so. So we have three very superb panelists to take on this task today, who have worked on forest issues from different perspectives. Zach Porter, who's based in Montpelier, so he's just come down the road, is the executive director and co-founder of an organization called Standing Trees. It's a nonprofit organization that's working on protecting the forests and stewarding them, and is engaged in litigation, often involving public lands. And I gather our environmental advocacy clinic here is doing some representation. So some of you, maybe you can raise your hands, are actually working on some litigation for Standing Trees. Any of you here?
Hiding in the back over there.
Aha. So this is an issue that VLGS is directly involved in. Then we have Yan-Mei Lin, who's a professor here at VLGS, and she's the acting director of our Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment and the deputy director of the U.S.-Asia Partnership. She's worked on forest issues internationally, and particularly with attention to China. And last but not least, Sheng Sun is also here at VLS, is the director of the International Lab for Sustainable Development. And he tends to look at issues through the lens of trade policy. And trade can have a tremendous impact on what's really happening on the ground with forests and the extent to which this society does not recognize their ecosystem services. So we'll start by looking at what do we really mean by ecosystem services and what kinds of services do the forests provide, with each panelist talking about the forests that they know. So we start with the scientific baseline. Then we'll move to the question of what kinds of law and policy can help protect those ecosystem services that are positively contributing to the natural environment and the social environment. So we'll look at law and policy, then open it up for a free-form, really unchoreographed, honestly, discussion among our three panelists about where do we go from here, what have we learned to date, what have we learned from each other, and then we'll have time for questions at the end from you all, so you will have a chance to interject. And as you listen, maybe you can go back to that image in your mind of your favorite forest, and you can think about what are the services that forest is providing that you think perhaps we should value more than we do today. So without further ado, we start with Zach, and they'll each take about 5 minutes to talk about which services, their ecosystem services they think are important. And to keep us on line, I have a subtle reminder here if people start running overtime, but I'm sure that won't be necessary. So Zach, start us off.
All
What's
right.
important for the New England forests for the services they provide?
Thank you. Wow, what an honor to be with all of you. And my goodness, the turnout at 5 p.m. on a Friday is impressive. Seriously. Thank you all for being here. It's really incredible to see. I am so deeply grateful to Vermont Law and Graduate School and the Environmental Advocacy Clinic in particular, to Eric and Julia and their colleagues at the EAC who have been working with us for the last several years now. It's just a thrill. And so I'm excited today to talk about an issue that matters a great deal to me. Our public lands and how we care for them and how we might reprioritize our management of them, considering the fact that the conditions today, from climate change to, of course, our present scientific understanding of the world around us, how much they have changed over the last 125 years since our federal public lands kind of came to be. So I actually wanted to start with a quote from President Theodore Roosevelt. Hopefully you can hear me while I read this. The greatest good for the greatest number applies to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form but an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of wildlife and the larger movement for the conservation of all our natural resources are essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method. And, grandiose quote from quite a while ago, but I think it is so important right now at this moment of mayhem, right, at the federal policy level, to think about the crossroads that we're at. And as our federal environmental laws come under attack, that's also an opportunity, I think, and I hope you all might see it that way too, to step into the void and to propose something better than what we've had for the last century and a quarter. And of course, we can think about that from many different perspectives, whether you care about healthcare policy, whether you care about, you name it, right? But especially as far as public land management goes, there is so much improvement that we can make, because for the last century, we've been more or less managing our public lands according to what? What's the theme that guides their management at both the state and federal level, right? It's multiple use management that has been kind of the guiding light. But has multiple use actually resulted in the provisioning of ecosystem services, the flood risk reduction that we need today, the clean water that we know we need today, the habitat for our native biodiversity? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. The multiple use system has actually kind of perpetuated the dominance of resource extraction in our public lands. And so what we've been doing at Standing Trees is trying to shift the priorities, shift the focus. And, that has involved taking a close look at the value of our forests here in New England for things like reducing the danger to our community from flood events, which we know are all becoming more common. This document on the left here is a report after Hurricane Irene about how Vermont's state lands might do a better job of protecting our communities during flood events. Looking at the clean water that we rely on for drinking, for recreation, for our economy. That's Lake Tarleton in the upper right there, not so far from here, where we're currently engaged in litigation. And then on the bottom right, a project in the Green Mountain National Forest that targets some of our oldest forests in Vermont for timber harvest, when these are the carbon breadbaskets of the region. And so, is it wise use? Is it appropriately honoring the greatest good for the greatest number in 2026? If we are inflicting the kind of damage that we are on a regular basis in the federal and state lands that we have here, just a minority of the landscape, about 11% of New England, shouldn't we prioritize those public goods and services in 2026 that are actually hurt when we prioritize resource extraction instead? So I'll circle back to maybe more slides and more of the science in a little bit, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a foundation for where we're coming from at Standing Trees and where we're going with the EAC's help. So I'll turn it over.
Sorry to be such a rude moderator.
That's all right.
But you left us with a pivotal question for the next round.
But thanks, Zach, and thanks, Professor Mill. And I'm really honored to be in this panel because you may know my name is Professor Lin, but you never know the meaning of the name, my family name. So actually, it's composed of two trees. So Lin is two trees, and that's considered woodlands. And then if you have three trees, that means forest. So that's many, because in Chinese, three represent many, many. But I have to say, nowadays in China, forests no longer just understood as covered by trees. So it is now increasingly understood by the public. It is multifunctional ecosystem. What this means, ecosystem, is they supporting livelihoods, protected watershed, as Zach mentioned,
mitigation, natural disaster like floods, and provide habitats and conservation of biodiversity play very important role in if you saw China's NDC, the forest is one of the key indicators in the climate strategies. So China's official statistics says now China's already exceed 25% of forest coverage, and its forest ecosystem is part of the national goal to construct what we now call ecological civilization and the meeting the double carbon goal, the peaking carbon emission in 2030 and carbon neutrality or meet the zero emission goal in by 2060s. But when we talk about China's forests, I don't know how many of you have been to China. Oh, great. Yes. It's a big country. So we have a boreal forest in the northeast, and then have mountain forests in the southwest. And where I come from in the south is subtropical forests, broadleaf evergreens, my hometown. And then also nowadays, China, because to prevent the desertification, they restore the forest in the northwestern part of China. So when we talk about forest ecosystem in China, it's really diversified forest ecosystem types, and they facing different challenges and pressures. But if you went to China, if you go to China, you can really see different forest ecosystem type. I really encourage you to go. And talking about science on ecosystem services within forests is not often considered as a bundle of services. And you might heard of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments that released by UN in 2005. And China is very embracing this concept. And actually I will talk about the guiding, many guiding technical guidelines for valuation of ecosystem services. They all follow of this distribution. So the first bundle is called regulating services, so that what we call forests can store carbon, retain water, purified water quality, conserve soil, reduce erosion, on, and also can provide habitat, maintain biodiversity. This all called regulation services, so all those services in this type. And the second type is provisioning services, and that's, you all know, providing timbers, products, mushrooms underneath the forest. So a lot of products actually provided by forests. In China, medical plants underneath of the forest system are very lucrative industry in China. Bamboo, other than timber product, it's all considered forest provision services. And finally, there are cultural services, as Zach mentioned, the scenic beauty for our next generation, the tourism, the spiritual heritage value, in particular for the southwestern part of China, where many ethnic minority groups, they live, and forest is their sacred place, has very valuable cultural services. So I would want to end up because this is the mandate for just provide the ecological forest system services.
Thank you. And that classification is really useful, I think, to think about the various different types of ecosystem services. So, Sean.
Awesome. Okay. So it's wonderful actually to take over just from Zach and Professor Ling, because I think my attention to tropical rainforest really have some connection to their works as well. I want to ask everyone, do you realize actually here we live in New England, but it used to have a very significant wood manufacturing and wood processing industry here. I'm wondering who knows that bit of history of this area. But nowadays, do you see that kind of manufacture or furniture making? Maybe not very often. I'm wondering, our students, if you go buy a piece of furniture, where you buy it? Do you buy it from local Vermont or New England furniture manufacturer. And do you know any of those manufacturers? It's very rare, right? And then
It's not IKEA.
it's not IKEA, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but yeah, and then Professor Lin just told us this wonderful story of how China managed actually to protect its forest and also the ecological service the forest actually provide for all of us in the more recent years in a very good way. But this is where my study comes out. I was looking to China actually doing better and better in its own forest regulation. But still, people globally, where is the wood processed and manufactured into furnitures? If it is not done here in North America, if it is not done in Europe, where it is? So I look at the data and I realize, all wood manufacturing has been moved, first from the United States and then to Taiwan, Hong Kong, right, Japan, South Korea, and later on after 1980s, go to China. So nowadays in China, actually, you have the biggest wood manufacture hub. But again, the country is actually very much populated, that, and it has a very stringent, resource situation. So there, to actually fit into such a big size of industry, where do you source your wood? Right. So that is my passion, I think. I look into that and I realize, okay, China is really sourced globally. So my passion, I think, very strangely sitting here in New England, but I really wanted to bring our attention to the tropical rainforest. I think I have a few slides here. So the tropical rainforest, of course, we know they are one of the most significant carbon sink globally. And also it's very, famous for being a biodiversity hotspot. But besides that, I also wanted to show you some of the very scientific part of how, I think my slides is the last two one. Yeah, some of the more scientific, aspect of the ecological service they provide. So in the tropical rainforest, the trees there, if you wanted to see them from a different perspective, it really works like air condition. So each individual average size tree there works quite, comparable to one AC that we use in our own residential building. And so the whole forest works like a giant AC, air conditioning that is cooling the atmosphere continuously. And that is actually due to the tree absorbing the lights and also the water, and then processing that, and then, hold it, and then, evapotranspiration process. The whole process itself is actually a cooling mechanism. And the other things that I wanted to, bring our attention to is that the tree there actually also plays with the moisture in the atmosphere. So when you have a raining season, for example, in Amazon, the rain goes down and the tree will absorb the rain, the water, and then it will push some of the water back to the atmosphere. And that actually kind of like regulate the moisture level in the atmosphere. That means when you have a big heavy cloud and you have a lot of rain, the tree will use some of that rain, some of that water, but will also push some of the water back to the back to the atmosphere. That will increase the chance for you to have another rain in the next few days. So that is really trying to stabilize the rainy season for the whole system. So what we have seen in the last few decades is that a lot of the tropical rainforest, especially in South America, that is Amazon, is eaten out by land clearance for agricultural purpose. So basically, they are converting those tropical rainforest into arable land, mainly for producing agricultural commodities like soy, corn, cotton, and also cattle ranch. And due to that effect, we lost this regulatory function of the forest for, stabilize our rainy season. So after 20 years or so, today, actually, the average dry season or drought season in Amazon is about 4 to 5 weeks longer. And also, the dryness is even like 30% more dry than, like 20 years ago. So that is a huge change. And that actually negative impact in return also meaning that we will have higher tree mortality rate, right? So the forest will more, will be easier for the forest to degrade. And as a result, when the forest degrade, there's a higher chance for it to be clear cut and turned into arable land. So that is a vicious circle that has been going on for quite some time.
Great. Thank you. So that just starts to scratch the surface, but hopefully it sets the scene for at least convincing you that the forests do provide very important ecosystem services with these examples. So now we'll turn to the question of what do we do with that information? How can we shape policies and law to try to protect those ecosystem services and make people more aware of what the forests are silently giving? So, Zach, you were starting to head down this road with federal policy. You work within the substantial architecture of federal policy and state. So, what are your thoughts about how best to protect the ecosystem services of the forest?
Feels more like a crumbling building than elaborate architecture right now, as I'm sure many of you are feeling too. But yeah, no, what a great conversation already. And I've traveled to Yunnan province, and I'm very excited to hear more about forest protection and management in China. Right now, again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to see the opportunity where it might otherwise seem like it's just chaos. And it's been quite the journey just recently. I'm sure you are all familiar with the 7-county decision and its kind of transformation on the National Environmental Policy Act. And it's really interesting being right in the thick of trying to take that Supreme Court decision and actually apply it in what might hopefully be helpful ways to continue to constrain Forest Service, the federal agency that we typically work with, Forest Service discretion, and to try to push that agency to do a better job of accounting for ecosystem services, among many other things that we would like them to take a hard look at. But just to focus on ecosystem services, one of the things that we're pretty happy about, I shouldn't say happy about, but feeling enthused about maybe small victories, right, that we all need to celebrate. In Vermont, in the Green Mountain National Forest, a major logging project that you may have heard about, the Telephone Gap Integrated Resource Project, which proposes about 12,000 acres of timber harvest. For the very first time in the history of the U.S. Forest Service, the Forest Service calculated the carbon emissions that would come from the timber harvest. That, seems like maybe a small victory when the project actually got approved, and it's still perhaps litigation is still in question, but small victories, right? And so if we want to protect ecosystem services, we have to first know what they are, what is at stake. And it hopefully is going to be incumbent on our federal agencies, established in case law and just based on their practice, that sharing that information with the public. How much carbon is going to be emitted from this project? What are the water quality impacts? The Green Mountain National Forest, until this project, hadn't been openly acknowledging the impacts that their timber projects were having on the Lake Champlain TMDL cleanup, restoration plan, which is remarkable to me, right? How can it be that a federal agency like the Forest Service wasn't thinking about the phosphorus contributions that its logging projects we're making on Otter Creek and other important waterways in Vermont? So incremental progress. There's litigation that we could talk more about. I'm afraid of the bell getting done here, so I'm racing through. But we could talk more about the litigation that we're involved in at the federal level, at the state level. you know, I guess I wanted to mention that there's constitutional law opportunities, and one of the great things that the EAC is involved in right now is trying to, you know, take the Vermont Constitution and make sure that the Agency of Natural Resources here is properly accounting for, you know, impacts to public trust waters, for example, and other public trust resources. We're trying to make sure that we're honoring the Common Benefits Clause in the Vermont Constitution, which hopefully guarantees that we are, you know, providing for the common good and not just for the benefit of the few, not just for those industries that might be extracting resources directly from our forests, but also calculating, accounting for, and protecting those resources that the rest of us rely on. Again, the clean water, the flood risk reduction, all those things that normally aren't accounted for when our state agencies are you know, figuring out what to do next. I'd love to talk more about that if we have more time later. And then I guess just I'll add in that, you know, of course, there's huge legislative opportunities, and Congress might seem like a dead end oftentimes. And so might the State House here in Montpelier, too, a lot of the time. But I will tell you, the State House is much more productive than Congress. And it is a great place for you all to, I hope, get some experience in policymaking. And you know, our lawmakers are amazingly accessible at the state level, especially compared to the federal level. And good ideas can become action relatively easily in Vermont. And so in our short time existing as an organization, just 5 years, you know, we're proud to have passed 2 bills, written and passed 2 bills. That's lightning speed from a legislation perspective. And that's not to say that everything is going swimmingly, but I hope that's been inspirational for me, that you know, you really can get involved and make a difference. And so maybe we can talk more about that too, but I don't want to go on too much longer. So
Great. Yan Mei.
Yeah,
China.
thank you.
Interesting things are happening in China too.
Thank you for coming to Yunnan. So because I want to provide a little bit historical context, like China seeing forests as multifunctional ecosystem has come a long way. So it really hit by the 1998 national floods. It's just huge flood, and they found out Yunnan's barren. So they cut down because they extract all the tree clear logging, so many communities trees that lead to the flooding. So they can really think, oh wow, we have to do something to prevent this. So the country launched a national called Natural Forest Protection Program, 天保工程, like. It is kind of prohibiting any logging starting from, so Yunnan's completely changed starting from 1998. So around that same period, China also launched the Grain to Green program, so which converted erosion farmland back into the forest land. So this 2 big project has been considered changing dramatically the dynamics between the forest protection strategy, and also now the Chinese language, again, ecological civilization. And actually on March 12th, just last week, we passed China's second code named Ecological Environmental Code. And the National People's Congress make environmental law or ecological environmental law as a separate legal departmental branch equal to civil law, constitutional law, administrative law, criminal law. So it's come a long way because they realize it is not just about timber product. But although I have to admit, China, it is the largest timber manufacturer now that's sourcing around the world. But in China, it is value the services. So I want to share a few techniques. Oh, so go back. Right. Okay, so this one. So it's not about, so now after that dramatic change 1998, it's not, China no longer not value the ecosystem services into that system. It's how to develop policy to really accounting or make it account into the services. So the first technique not first, but I would say this is from my familiarity. So my practice, the first one is the most familiar to me is called a liability model because US-Asia Partnership, we have really a long time program trying to support our Chinese partner to implement stimulate environmental public interest litigation and really trying to help recover the environmental harm from wrongdoing. So this is we call ecological environmental damages and compensation systems. And in this model, the value of the forest ecosystem is visible when it is lost. So you can see there are two models here. And actually the model is we transplanted from the US natural resource damages model. So there is if there's an event like clear cutting, illegal logging or action that harm the forest, then that means the service and resource level down. So you cannot see that, but it's called habitat losses or ecosystem service loss. And then you will have another, if there's no that event, that means the service provision will be in the horizontal level. So then the equation is to measure assessment. What are the loss, the ecosystem services loss? Again, this is the services category, the regulation, the provision, the cultural services as a basic line. And each of the box, they will have a formula that we're not going to that. But I want to provide you an example that we litigate a case in Guangdong province. We support Friends of Nature, one of China's NGO, to sue the tourist developers that they illegally clear cutting the forest, trying to build the roads to lead up to the peak of the forest. And they found out they didn't follow any of the permitting, like legitimate permitting, planning, etc. So we filed a case against those company. And so the NGO actually have to hire some experts to calculate what are the damages. So the good thing is they're not just looking at how many trees that's been cut, how many, like this is not just looking about the commodity value of the trees that have been cut or illegally cut. They're actually looking at, okay, if we need to restore the ecosystem services of this areas, this hectare, physical restore those services, how much projects or restoration project need to implement it, and the defendants or the violator have to pay for those costs. And most importantly, it's not just restore to the origin. The defendant or the violator have to pay for the we call interim ecosystem services. So that means during the time of restoration, if they were not able to restore, they have to pay for those services, quantify it, and they normally use many methods, but one of the key methods is they will need to implement supplement to a fund and to support other restoration project. For example, this is the animal corridor. So this is the one model. I know the time's changing, but I need to go quickly. Another model is called ecological compensation, and that's different from liability based. It is about it's not about wrongdoing, but no one do something wrong, but it's called benefit sharing and fairness across jurisdiction. We know ecosystem services, forest system, they cross boundaries. So your upstream forests, they have to provide more ecosystem services, and downstream benefit from those services. So how to make it equal? So China actually follow other countries. I think it's also learned from Europe and US payment to ecosystem services, but have China's its unique characteristic. So this example is in Zhejiang and Anhui province called Xin'anjiang River watershed. So Anhui province is the upstream. And then Zhejiang province, in order to make sure they're getting the water source meet the drinking water source quality, they're willing to support Anhui province. So please don't develop. You provide the services. So we have to horizontally sign the compensation agreement, not just give you money, but also support with technology, capacity building, develop joint program. This pilot beginning in 2012, it's so successful that China now actually passed the regulation governing ecological protection compensation. So encourage the provinces, the cities to sign those agreements that beneficiaries will provide monetary and others mechanism scheme to the provider, the ecosystem service or storage providers. Finally, I want to quickly go over, sorry, what we are talking about, the accounting and the carbon market.
We'll find a way to work that in eventually. Yes. So this is two interesting, very different approaches so far of the regulatory approach through ZAC, and then the various different forms of compensation, financial recognition. So Sheng, what do you have to add to the table?
I think I will bring our attention to a sector that has traditionally not doing a very good job actually integrating this kind of ecological service value into our decision making, that is trade and investment, right? I think a lot of the momentum that has been built up either in domestic programs or international programs, supporting this kind of valuing of the ecological service, you have to base that on very scientific understanding. Right, you have to know what the value is, because I think there are two ways that we can value something. One is really using the economic terms, and we have this willingness to pay. So consumers will be willing to pay, this or that much more to retain that service. The other is really political will, right? Sometimes when we are talking about a decision making or policy making or a law making, we're essentially talking about the political will of the whole population, of the whole group, to really give value to this service, even though we don't put a monetary tag there, but still we are going to save that. But for trade, I think both, comes with certain kind of difficulties. First of all, as I just mentioned, it's a very long and complicated supply chain. The timbers might be produced in Amazon or in West Africa, and then sometimes even in the United States, and then it's transported like tens of thousands of miles away to China, and was manufactured there into furnitures, and then was sold globally, even back to the United States, right? So it's a long chain, and for the downstream actors or operators, for you to have that understanding, what has been going on upstream, right, where the timber has been harvested or produced, you lost that capacity. Right, so traditionally, this is really the challenge because, when we don't see it, when the things are not visible, we tend to lost our care to the matter, right? So that's really a big deal. But I think what Zach and Yeme just mentioned is really becoming very encouraging signals. And I would also like to share a very encouraging development more recently, like, how this kind of effort to really make those values visible and also to, express that value either in the economic terms or political will can actually translate into very, innovative, I think, actions. So my case here is the EUDR, EU Deforestation Regulation. So this is a relatively recent EU law. So it was enacted in 2023. But unfortunately, even today, it is not actually into enforcement yet. The enforcement of this law has been delayed twice already. So the original enforcement date is supposed to be 2024, end of that year, but then it's delayed to 2025 and now to 2026. But what is this law about? So this law essentially mandates that, if you are a seller or operator or trader, if you wanted to put certain product into the EU market, or if you wanted to export into EU market, you have to make sure that, certain commodities you put there does not come from land where it has been deforested starting from 2020, or where the land has experienced significant forest degradation. So that's the basic logic of the law. So to make that work, basically you're requiring all the operators, the economic actors, traders, to get some idea where your commodity comes from. So there are essentially 7 different types of commodities that is covered by this law. First, of course, timber, but also agricultural commodities like soybean, rubber, palm oil, cattle ranch, right? Cattle and beef product, and also cocoa and coffee. So for those commodities, it's actually internationally traded commodities. The operators, the traders there, you have to understand where your product is actually produced. So the number one requirement for this law to really be effective is that the operators, they know the geolocation where the product is produced. And they also know in that geolocation, what is the environmental situation there? And what is the other, social community factors that is relevant? So the second point is that this law also requires that the product, you put on the EU market also when it is produced, like when the timber is harvested or when the soybean is grown, it has to also follow all the local legal requirement from the country of origin. So it's not only, deforestation free. You also have to pay attention to, for example, labor rights, human rights, community development, and other sort of agreement you have there at the country of origin. And thirdly, they also requires that you have to make all this information into something we call a due diligence declaration or statement, meaning that you have to make that statement yourself, the operators, but you have to make all your evidence transparent and also verifiable. So that is a huge effort, I think, the operators is required to take. But it's a very interesting development because, as we mentioned, I think in the previous panel, for the mining sector, there's a lot of volunteer-based, verification mechanisms. But I think for the timber sector, this is perhaps one of the sectors, when we talk about trade and supply chains, which really have this, very innovative, but also first of a kind regulatory approach applied in a very sizable market. But of course that law is still being developed and is still being implemented, and I'm more than willing to talk about the details, but I will just stop here.
Very interesting. So now we go into the free range segment and so I'll just kick it off with one question, and then you all can decide where you want to take it, which aspects you want to pick up on, and then after that we'll have questions and answers, so you'll have a chance to engage as well. So I'll just start kind of with the question of how do we build from an advocacy perspective, if we want to try to increase the protection of forest services to the ecosystem, how do we build that political momentum? And to what extent, thinking of the example of flooding, to what extent does that motivation come out of our own self-interest politically? Or what's the message that can really work in the US or in other countries or in Europe with its deforestation? How do you build the message that will achieve success? So that's just launch and take it where you would like and in other directions.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Let me finish my my third approach, because that's exactly the incentive. Because if familiar with China's political system, it's under a cadre evaluation system. So it's not democratic. We don't select our county leader. We don't select our provincial governors. So each of the leaders of a different jurisdiction, they kind of have a performance yardstick. So kind of how many GDP of your province in this year have growth. So in the past, they all grow, like their motivation for their performance is based on GDP, how much economic growth. So nowadays, the environmental, they just released the 15 5-year plan recently in the National People's Congress conference. And nowadays, the economic growth is called guiding indicators. But the environmental indicator is called binding indicators. And ecosystem services is very important because they create, that's called ecosystem services accounting or natural resource accounting. Basically, if a cadre, if a mayor or governor, if they leave their post after 5 years of tenure in their position, they have to be evaluated on whether they depleted the natural, they call originally call natural assets, but now we also call ecological services accounts, whether they're depleting that accounts. So there's many methods to do the accounting system. So you accounting the province and this accounting statistic, they have both physical account, like how many hectares of forest when your original in this post have, when you leave, how many hectares have been increased or depleted, and also monetary. So it's not just about how many hectare of forest, it's the value, how much services you present out. So this is a report they produce for Guangxi provinces. So they can have many indicators. So that's back to Zach's question, is how you use this information like into the planning or your economic plan and zoning land use decision, because you now can see if I keep this as a forest land, the monetary for coping the ecosystem services are much higher than if you're just counting the number of timbers. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to finish up the third approach.
Oh, free range.
Okay, yeah, I think in terms of how to build up this political momentum, I wanted to stress the importance of technology. Because I have this background of computer science and electronic engineering. So I started remote sensing for my undergraduate. But I think it's only, later in my career, I began to realize, even for environmental law, especially for trade and investment regulation, how big a role this technology can really play. For example, for the EU regulation I just mentioned, I think the entire regime is actually based on the capability of human being, nowadays being able to see what has been going on in the geolocations that you are sourcing your product. Right, so that you can use either remote sensing. You can also using satellite image. You can also use other like geographic information science, and for analyzing those data and also for discovering potential risks or risk situations there. You can use data analysis. You can even use AI to figure all those things out. So that really make it much more cost efficient for the companies and operators to be able to conduct this kind of due diligence, management. And for the right messaging, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the strange but very interesting geopolitical and geoeconomic trends. Sometimes that is, helping the development of those new legal regime. Because traditionally we know, like if I'm talking about international trade or international environmental law, you sort of have to have all the countries, on board, and you got this kumbaya moment, and everybody say, okay, we have the consensus, everyone, and then we have this agreement or that agreement. But I think increasingly nowadays, when you watch, this EU timber regulation, EU deforestation regulation, why they managed to actually come through, I think the messaging part is a big part of that, because I think the economic logic there is that, for countries like China, we all know for a long time the criticism for international trade is that it is not balanced. So China is definitely buying a lot from the developing countries in terms of resources, but it's selling a lot for the global north, right? To the United States, to EU. But when the United States and the EU are figuring out, okay, what we can sell to China, right, it's very hard. And also for the United States or EU to compete with, for example, Brazil, your environmental standard and the stringent of the regulation is really set at different levels, right? And sometimes you put a lot of resources, subsidies, to figure out what is the carbon sink there, what is the value of the service, but that cannot be captured by those developing countries. So when you go there and put your product into the global market, you have this comparative disadvantage, right? So you have to get that correct as well. So part of the argument, I think, for this EU regulation is also, this is an effort that we're trying to rebalance the global trade, not in a way that is harming the development rights of the developing countries, but in a way, I think in a long-term sense, is even beneficial for the developing countries. I will give you a case why it is beneficial. For example, for the case of Brazil, we just talked about the Amazon forest, right? There is this very interesting statistics for years. If you look into the Brazilian economy, the growth rate of the GDP is like 1%, 2%, 3%. And if you discount that with the inflation rate, it's basically a stagnated economy. But the only sector is claiming like double-digit growth in the past 20 years or so is the agricultural sector. And that, very unbalanced growth of one specific sector also translate later into a gigantic vested interest, right? So you have more and more agribusiness interest, operating their economic and also political influence in the country system. And that changed all the dynamics of the politics of the country and also all the regulations and the laws, how those laws and regulations is made or is enforced. So I think for those countries, this is perhaps what we usually call the curse of resource. The country is really rich in this resource, but if you rely on this sector, you get your development, into some kind of like very unhealthy and unbalanced corner, and you wanted to get yourself out. But if there's no, incentives or motivations applied from outside, sometimes for the country itself to get themselves out, it's very hard. So I guess that is also part of the things that we can consider when we advocate this kind of, new approaches for international trade.
Actually, I have a question for Zach because I really want to know how New England or Vermont can integrate ecosystem services into like planning, budgeting, land use decisions. You mentioned that in the deliberation of the legislature, how they talk about it. Because in China, as I mentioned, they're using the cadre performance review as a system to force them to review those statistics of accounting. But how that work in, like how they integrate this ecosystem service concept into planning and land use decision?
Yeah, good question. There's no simple answer. I focus on public land management, and to varying degrees, state and federal agencies monitor the impacts of their actions, better or worse. I would say monitoring is not the U.S. Forest Service's strong suit historically. There may be incredible technology out there, but we're not deploying that for the most part when it comes to actually assessing the impacts of our decisions and then using that information to inform future decisions. And it's interesting, I would say on the whole, ecosystem services have not played a major role in, the approaches of our state and federal land management agencies. I think we're just beginning to understand, the science of eco and economics of ecosystem service valuation. I also want to share a report with all of you that I hope you'll check out online. I didn't bring copies for everybody in the room, obviously, but you can find the PDF on our website. We had an economist do an evaluation of the ecosystem services produced by Vermont's state and federal public lands. And it's hard for me to believe that we were the first entity, I think, to ever do that. In 2018, I think the Trust for Public Land, a large land trust, put out a report on the ecosystem service value of different land cover types in Vermont, right? So what's the value per acre of a wetland in Vermont? What's the value per acre of a hardwood forest in Vermont? That was the level at which we were starting to understand ecosystem services. And, I'm going to say politics comes into play a lot here because it's kind of a safe place to be if we just suggest that all forests are the same. That, every acre of hardwood forest is producing the same amount of ecosystem services. That's a really non-controversial place to be when you're suggesting, that conservation has this value or that value. What we wanted to do in our analysis was to really dig a little bit deeper, because obviously, and I'm although I think it's not so obvious to most of the public because people don't grow up in this country with an ecological education, sadly. But the way that you take care of those lands, the way that we relate to those lands has a huge impact on the ecosystem services that those lands are producing, right? It's kind of an illusion that just because Vermont is green, it's producing clean water, right? I think most of the country looks at our state, our political leaders, and assume that we're quite a bit greener than we actually are. That's I think the big secret in Vermont, that we're keeping from everybody else sometimes. And of course, our water tells a different story. And that here in the Connecticut watershed with the nitrogen pollution here, the phosphorus pollution in the Champlain Basin, and of course we see it when our communities are underwater, literally. And so I think it does take a bit of shock, sadly, sometimes for people to realize that, oh my gosh, that harmful algal bloom that's preventing me from swimming in that water, maybe I should be paying attention to what's going on upstream. Or, when my town, Montpelier, was under several feet of water a few years ago, that gives everybody a chance to think about, hopefully, well, what was going on in the forest upstream, or what have we been doing development-wise that might have contributed to this? Sadly, I think it's only human nature, but we move on from disasters so quickly as a species. I think it's a part of, how we've adapted and evolved, right? And already it's painful as a Montpelier resident to see how that moment of opportunity that followed the floods has already seemed to pass for really trying to think about things differently in our town and our larger watershed. But I still think there's quite a bit of political momentum out there. Of course, we're hitting headwinds at the federal level and even at the state level with people reacting to greater regulation and ideas about changing land use. But I think something that we really have focused on from the beginning at Standing Trees is to help people get over the ecological amnesia that I think is a part of growing up in a place that has suffered so much ecological degradation, right? We don't have a reference point for what a healthy forest is anymore. Few people on Earth do. That's not your fault. It's just the fact that we don't have a forest to visit that would be an example of what has been lost and what we might work towards once again, right? Less than 1/10 of 1%, less than 1/10 of 1% of Vermont and New England's forests resemble the natural forests that were here prior to colonization. And so without that reference point, it's really hard to know, again, how far we've fallen and what we need to do politically and to make change happen. I don't know if I answered your question fully, but there's so much more that we could say, but that's a start anyways.
And we'll have time with questions and answers, but your point also about the small percentage left of virgin forest goes back to Sheng's early point about how we used to be a lumber producing region, and now we're regrowing, but that was the consequence. And it's interesting to see the comparison of what you're talking about with awareness of upstream activities in Vermont and what Jan May is talking about with the cooperative agreement of upstream and downstream payments for the ecological services, and then to take it internationally, the effect on the Amazon of trade, and that's the lung of the globe, and yet how do we protect that when the decision making is very diffused? So with that, it's your turn to ask questions. So who has a question that they would like to pose? Yes, sir. I think we have a microphone coming.
Thank you so much, Professor Zach, for your interventions. Really interesting. I just have one point to make because when you see like deforestation in the Amazon, it's really heartbreaking. And when you name the soybean exploitation, I just have to make a point about that, which is that most of the soybean is used to feed animals. It's not that vegans are destroying the Amazon. And if the world adopted a plant-based diet, we will reduce global agricultural land use from 4 to 1 billion hectares. So even the European Union has adopted like a strategy to move towards a plant-based diet. What do you think that is so difficult? Do you think is that impossible? What are your thoughts about? Because from my point of view, I think that will be the most efficient way to save the Amazon and to save our forest.
This shows that the policy world is very interrelated. You can't just focus on forests. Who'd like to?
I think first, Professor Lin must have a lot of things to share because my understanding of the Chinese diet is that it's heavily plant-based. So that is the part I think she might have more knowledge. For me, I think the thing that we also wanted to pay attention is the movement in some of the developing countries, because usually when the economy of the country get developed more and more, the meat consumption of that country goes higher and higher. So I think sometimes, because I experienced this myself when I grew up in China, the country is developing, is industrialized, and we see all the changes to our lifestyle. But I think some of the interventions, this new concept comes too late. Right, and the voice is also too small. So I think now we also have many other countries, I think, is climbing this development ladder. It's very crucial for us to bring this message and this, idea to them as soon as possible. Yeah, that's I think my 2 cents. But I think it's a huge issue, and yeah, how to eat more vegetables.
I think I have to say, actually, China's traditional diet is very plant-based. If we go to Yunnan, because one of the provision services of the forest is they grow so many different kind of vegetables and plant-based products to be consumed by the community. So now I think the problems is the provision services is no longer just focusing on that ecosystem. Like if a watershed level, as you mentioned, the soybean produced in the Amazon actually go all the way to China's the Taiyuan watershed, and then the phosphorus contamination of those watersheds. So there's a term called planetary boundary. So the nutrient cycle is move from like the chemical fertilizers to plant soybeans, and then move to China to feed the animals, and then contaminate those water. So, but in the traditional ecosystem, all the provision services are within that system. So now it's all across the globe. It's how we actually right now China is thing they need to build an ecological civilization. So all their accounting within their own jurisdiction, but they are also a world factory hub. So they sourcing all the product here and then sell to all the different countries. So how you account those ecosystem in a global scale? But then also it will encounter another nightmare challenge of governance, because the current political system that our keynote speaker just talked about. So I don't have answers. So that's why we all need students here, the next generation, or the thinkers. Yeah, thank you, because that's exactly, you capture the key environmental challenges. You can call it Anthropocene challenge or planetary crisis, but whatever, it is the crisis.
More questions? It also goes to the basic issue of how we're defining sustainability, the theme of this symposium. At what scale or scales do we deal with sustainability?
I have a question about environmental valuation. I'm curious if it's necessarily a downfall of environmental valuation that communities could place different values on ecosystem services than other communities. As I'm particularly imagining a small community that's heavily reliant on timber production still, they might place a much higher value on that timber for its extraction purposes rather than its ecosystem valuation. So I was curious on your take on that.
I think that's a really interesting question. And absolutely, I think down to the personal individual level, right? We all put a different level of value on ecosystem services and raw materials, and that has so much to do with personal economic circumstances, and yeah, on down the list. I guess, where we're coming from as an organization is we want New Englanders and people across this country to think critically and creatively about public lands. And to give you all some perspective here, because I think these stats aren't widely known, right? Our U.S. federal public lands, mostly U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands, provide just 4% of the total annual timber harvest volume in this country. Just 4%. We cut about the volume of wood each year in the U.S. that we use in the U.S. But interestingly, as has been mentioned, we ship a lot of that wood elsewhere, and then it might find its way back to us, or that happens here in Vermont. It's pretty amazing. We ship trees from the Green Mountain National Forest to China on a regular basis. It's hard to believe, I don't think we think of Vermont as a wood exporter to that degree, but we absolutely are. In fact, Vermont today, we cut 1.5 times the volume of wood that we consume in Vermont every single year on a volume basis. And so there's no wood shortage, right? In terms of, if you ever hear that the wood supply is running out, that's just not true. We're growing lots of wood in this state, and we're sending a lot of it elsewhere. And we're using a lot of it very inefficiently, including for things like biomass electricity, are some of our greatest sources of carbon. And so I think what we're encouraging people to do is to think about what's the highest and best use of different land ownership types, right? There are different pressures on private lands for all of those personal individual reasons. Putting your kid through college, figuring out how you're gonna hold on to your house. Those are real factors. Making sure that your house is heated through a tough Vermont winter. Those are incredibly personal decisions that landowners are making every single day. We don't have to make those same decisions on our public lands. We can think a little bit differently, but we don't traditionally think all that differently about the value of public lands compared to private lands. In fact, we typically lump them all together, and the Forest Service is really good at making you think that the Green Mountain National Forest or the White Mountain National Forest really isn't that much different from any other land out there, and we should just treat it the same. Is that really how we should be treating it? So that's the question that we're asking, and again, trying to produce some more literature to back up our suggestion that no, let's press pause, let's rethink what the values are here. So I hope that helps to answer a little bit.
I think a little bit difference in China. China, no matter what, you are collectively owned forest land. There is no, I guess there's no privately owned. So collectively owned forest land or public land, like state-owned or provincial-owned, they all using the same standardized valuation method, because as I mentioned, there are many guidelines, national standard to evaluate those services. But I know the Forest Stewardship Council, they do publish guideline and standards for private owners to make their stewardship for ecosystem service impacts to be visible, so they can make it tradable. So you're not just trade the lumber product, you also trade the impacts of your stewards of ecosystem services. And I think carbon market is one of the significant one. But you will say, well, carbon sequestration is just only one services the forest provide, but it is now the at least largest quantifiable tradable services And this is more standardized than what you think that plays different value for the communities. I know Vermont also have led by the TNC, they aggregate several private donors to obtain those carbon credits. Yeah.
Another question? Yes, in the back.
We actually have a question from online.
Great.
So the question reads, how does the concept of hysteresis fall within your thoughts of forest ecosystem restoration or sustainability? That is, ecosystems that fall into alternative stable states often require subsidies to return to more desirable stable states.
Can you repeat the first sentence again?
Absolutely. How does the concept of hysteresis fall within your thoughts of forest ecosystem restoration or sustainability?
So is anyone here familiar with hysteresis?
I'm not.
Or is anyone in the audience familiar so we can better respond?
Oh, looks like Julia's got.
Julia.
There, yes.
Excellent.
The person who has asked the question apologized, so I don't know if that means they're rescinding the question.
I'm just going to read what's on Matthew's computer, but hysteresis is the dependence on the state of a system on its history. So I'm assuming that the question is getting at I'm not sure actually, but the definition is a state of a system on its history. Hysteresis.
Do we have another comment that might help us?
I don't know. My question kind of was similar to this. And based off what you said about we don't really know what we're restoring to, I'm wondering what science and Indigenous voices roles might play in making sure that we're restoring land back to like the right ecosystem first, like not ignoring the importance of grasslands and the ecosystem services that they provide, and also like planting native plants and spaces. So we're not just focusing on like carbon sequestration broadly and not like the different services that maybe biodiversity plays.
So Isabella, does that seem consistent with the question that we had online?
Tragically, no, but I think since you've asked it, y'all should answer.
Well, maybe I can try to get at both questions for a second. So if I'm understanding the prior question decently, I don't know, I don't know if I am. I think it absolutely, I think it took major government action a century and a half ago to move us off of the stable state that we had reached in the late 1800s. I think what I would call the stable state of complete deforestation here in the Northeast, right? We were at maximum 80% deforested in the mid to late 1800s here in New England. And the policy solution at the time was, let's do something to make sure that we have trees on the landscape again, which is not so dissimilar to, I think, some of the situation in China with desertification and trying to, now a century and a half later, I think one of the problems that we're facing is we're still dealing with with statutes and policies that kind of oftentimes date back to that time period, as opposed to grappling with the current situation, which is, wow, miraculous. We have forests back, or at least trees back. Let's say we have trees back on the landscape. Now what do we do? And now we have to do the work of figuring out, what are those laws and policies that we need to make sure that we do a better job of taking care of that resource. And so we're out of the just like recovery mode in some ways, and now we're into the next phase. And to your question, absolutely, we need to be thinking about what were those indigenous ways of being and knowing, making decisions with that information, with, of course, all of the other, best available science. And we can't go back to what was here 500 years ago. We've already lost species that were here not even 500 years ago, and we're on the verge of losing more right now. So change is constant, but I think we can set our goalposts based on what we know a forest here wants to be. And so we can use the past to inform the future, but yeah, we're absolutely deluding ourselves if we think we can get back to exactly what was here. So good questions.
Did we by any chance get a clarification online of the question?
Yes. And actually that Director Porter, your answer actually goes to it, because what the question was asking about is that idea of equilibrium. So as you mentioned, like, some species don't exist anymore. One example just comes to mind is like the chestnut tree. Chestnut, like American chestnuts, predominant critical part of North American forests, no longer are, yet, the environment continues. It's found a new equilibrium. And so the question, kind of building off of that is getting at that idea of like, well, what are the cost and valuations associated with trying to return to that equilibrium, or do we just accept that? At least that's the way we're kind of understanding it.
Yeah, and I don't want to be talking too much here. I also don't want to be sounding too cynical in the sense that I do think that we should expect to have American marten and mountain lions and wolves back in our landscape. So we aren't deluding ourselves to think that that kind of species recovery is possible. Even perhaps someday, some tree species that are suffering today could be doing better again if we don't cut them all down in the meantime, trying to avoid the spread of disease and whatnot. So I don't want to sound like I'm saying we can't get back some of what has been lost. I hope I'm not leaving that message with you.
And also this restoring to the or paying to restore to an equilibrium kind of goes to one of your Chinese examples of payments for damage that has occurred and actual attempts to restore.
Yeah, I think on the case-by-case scale is they now really push very hard to anyone damaged the forest have to restore or compensate or pay the damages. But on the other hand, for the history losses I give the example here is called Sai Han Ba. Mechanical Forest Farm Afforestation Carbon Sink Project. If you search on the internet, there's a lot of video and documentary about how China reforested of this area. Then definitely there's some mistake made, right? Originally, you just want to grow trees as fast as possible. So you think, but they don't understand actually a so complex ecosystem. Now they're doing more based on best science and using multi-species and not monoculture. So it's also become new understanding. But those restoration project is in like non-forested areas. But I think you're right. For those areas that have inhabit ethnic minority groups and people, how their traditional knowledge can contribute to restoration efforts. And this is also very dear to our hearts. And that's the US-Asia Partnership right now working on a project called Community Resilience. And the whole goal is trying to engage the ethnic minority groups to using their traditional knowledge to kind of continue using ecological farming. It doesn't mean we just talk about China's biggest project to green to grain. So they trying to restore all the farmland back to forest. But on the other hand, actually a lot other ecological farming practice are very beneficial for the forest ecosystem because they are a mosaic of the complex ecosystem. And you really have to have the community, ethnic minority traditional knowledge engaged because they have accumulated those knowledge and they know the biodiversity of the plant species, how they work together. So I think you're absolutely right. So there's many funds for this is a very national driven, Sai Han Ba is a very national driven project. But for small projects, I think every community contribution can count.
So I think probably our time is up. Or one, sure.
Hello. I'm very loud.
Firstly, I would love to address, because when Professor Janet asked us to imagine a forest in our heads, I thought of a Atlantic forest. And when you said that the Professor Sheng, that you study a tropical rainforest, was almost a woo-woo moment for me. Like, yes, was the forest I was imagining. But my question goes to the conundrum, and I'd love to hear your opinion about the conundrum of demand, because when you think about plant-based diets, is also a huge demand for monoculture, and how that feeds also when an industry, for example, the wood pellet industry for biomass, its demand comes from Europe Union, and that was the main countries that invest in that. Do you think there is a way out of this complex conundrum of demand, of trying to do what's right, but also not overburdening the clean aspect of the way out? I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll try.
I'm not sure if I get the question completely, but yeah, I think it's a conundrum. But I think in a way it's kind of like related to the last question we talked about, because I think when we think about nature, it's really an open system. I wouldn't say like nature is like human beings, but I think nature is not science in a lot of way. Because I think for science we can really study it as an aid, right? But for nature, I think even if we don't say like nature has personalities, but definitely it has a history that is beyond our lifespan. So we don't really know it. And there's also no way that we can know it, like down to earth know it. So I think whatever we do, the human impact on those nature systems is always temporary. And what we can restore or what we can value is always incomplete. So that's, I think, maybe the philosophical part of the discussion that I can offer to your question.
I'll make a go at it. I mean, you're exactly right that we have a situation where global markets are pushing for the commodification of forests in ways that lead to extreme degradation. I mean, anybody who's traveled through the Southeast US has seen the degree to which the natural forests have been replaced with plantations, and it's startling when you head down there. And I think there's also this blind faith in the Northeast that somehow we are immune to that, or that our laws are substantial enough to prevent that from happening here. And with the evisceration of NEPA that's underway, among other laws, the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and others, I am very scared that we're going to see, similar impacts to northeastern U.S. forests because that market hasn't gone away yet. I am hopeful that people are waking up to the problems with just biomass electricity, to name one example. But we have to create stronger laws to insulate our forests, and also, I think, getting at something that was brought up by the other panelists here, especially on private lands, I think create other ways for people to survive, on those lands, other than selling off what the timber industry calls low-grade wood, right? Which to me is the most insulting term. If I was a member of the forest community, I would be deeply offended that somebody thought there was such a thing as low-grade wood, right? There is no such thing as low-grade wood in a forest ecosystem. It's all important, but we hear all the time about how we need to create new markets for this material that won't pay its way out of the forest. I mean, that is essentially what we're talking about. Is how do you make it economically profitable to get rid of that material that you can't turn into a board. And so, we've seen how the presence of biomass energy markets and the creation of markets for this new building material called cross-laminated timber, that leads to different practices in the forest. And the University of Vermont has done good research on this, showing that harvest intensifies when you create those kinds of new markets. And so even though it's often framed as, oh, we're just, we're making use of this residue, this waste, well, waste to whom, right? And I think in some cases, it's maybe the creation of a payment for ecosystem services, type model for private landowners. Perhaps, we don't work in that space ourselves. From a public lands perspective, I hope it's a political and policy choice that we make, that our public lands are more important than being sold off for Drax power plant in England to burn for biomass electricity and claim that that's somehow clean energy, right? So I think there's different solutions for different parts of our map, our economy. But good question.
And it's been fascinating to hear the different experiences in different kinds of settings, both in terms of the forest, the qualities of the forest, the attributes, and the solutions that are emerging. So thank you very much for all of the contributions from the panelists. Thank you for your close attention and for your questions. And we just hope that maybe this has whetted your appetite a bit. So when you go look at trees the next time or go for a walk, maybe you'll think more about the ecosystem services they provide and more ways that we can recognize and protect those services, so the answers aren't necessarily simple. So thank you very much.
Okay.